Elden Ring is packed with so many hidden details, secret references, and buried lore connections that even after thousands of hours, players are still finding things the developers quietly tucked away, and tonight we are going through every single one of them. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So, a little bit about why this video exists and how I put it together. I have spent a genuinely embarrassing amount of time in the lands between. Not just playing, but pausing, reading item descriptions, cross-referencing dialogue, re-watching cutscenes, frame by frame, and digging through community wikis and data-mined files. What started as a personal notes document turned into something I felt was worth sharing. When assembling this list, I made a deliberate choice to prioritize Easter eggs that reward curiosity, meaning the kind of detail that makes you stop and think, rather than details that are just visually impressive. I also chose to present things as interpretations rather than hard facts, because Elden Ring's lore, written in collaboration with George R.R. Martin and Hidetaka Miyazaki, is intentionally ambiguous. A lot of what we think we know is actually just one very reasonable reading of incomplete information. With that said, let's get into it. Easter Egg 1. When you first arrive in Limgrave and walk toward the ruins near the starting area, there is a body slumped against a broken wall. On that body is a note. The note reads like a journal entry from someone who made it further than most, only to give up just short of something important. This suggests the developers placed it there deliberately, as a kind of greeting card for the player. It points toward a recurring theme in the game, which is that countless others have tried what you're trying, and almost all of them have failed. It is quiet and easy to miss, but it sets the tone for everything that follows. Easter Egg 2. The first sight of Grace you encounter in Limgrave emits a golden mist that flows in a specific direction. That direction always points roughly towards Stormvale Castle. This is not random. The sights of Grace in the game are said to guide Tarnish toward the Erd Tree, but this one points toward a more immediate destination. It suggests the developers used environmental direction as a subtle navigation tool, so that players who pay attention to the world itself, rather than the minimap, would naturally be guided forward. Easter Egg 3. In the tutorial cave, there is a message carved into the stone floor that reads, in part, try jumping. If you follow that advice and jump off what appears to be a dead-end ledge, you land on a platform below that contains a useful early game item. This is one of the most discussed and beloved Easter eggs in the game's opening moments, and it suggests that From Software wanted to communicate their design philosophy immediately. The world rewards experimentation. Jumping is a new mechanic for the Soulsborne series, and the developers essentially told you that right at the start. Easter Egg 4. The name Margit the Fell Omen is worth unpacking. In Old Norse and Germanic tradition, a fell omen refers to a sign of coming doom. The word fell itself in English carries a double meaning, both referring to something cruel or fierce, and to the act of cutting something down. Margit is one of the first major bosses players encounter, and his name suggests he is both a portent and a destroyer. This kind of etymological layering appears throughout the game and points toward a writing process that paid close attention to language and myth. Easter Egg 5. Margit's walking cane, which he carries into battle and later transforms into a magical weapon, resembles the staff carried by certain figures in Norse mythology associated with wisdom and wandering. The design suggests an old traveller turned tyrant, someone who once moved through the world quietly, but now uses that same quiet posture as a disguise for something far more dangerous. It is a subtle visual piece of storytelling that tells you something about Margit's history before he says a single word. Easter Egg 6. Stormvale Castle contains a room filled with hanging cages. Inside some of those cages are human remains. But one cage, tucked in a corner, that many players never find, contains a live bird. The bird is unreachable. You cannot interact with it. It just sits there. This small detail suggests the developers were thinking about what survival looks like in a world defined by rot and ruin. Something small and fragile, completely out of place, somehow still alive. It is one of the more quietly affecting details in the early game. Easter egg 7. The grafted scion, the enemy that kills you at the very start of the game, before you even have a chance to fight back, can actually be defeated. This is something many players never know. If you manage to kill it, you receive 2 items from its body. The fight is brutally difficult at that stage, but it is possible. This suggests the developers intentionally designed a moment that looks like a guaranteed loss but is not, and that the reward for refusing to accept that framing is real. It points toward a design philosophy of questioning assumed inevitability. Easter egg 8. Godric the Grafted has a second phase where he grafts a dragon's head onto his arm. The roar that Dragonhead lets out is not just a sound effect. If you listen carefully and compare it to other dragon sounds in the game, it is recognizably the same roar used by a specific dragon found elsewhere in the lands between. This suggests the dragon's head Godric grafted onto himself was taken from a real and specific creature, rather than being a generic body part. It adds a layer of grim detail to what is already a disturbing character concept. Easter egg 9. Godric's throne room contains tapestries on the walls that depict the history of the golden lineage. If you walk slowly through the room before the boss fight and look at those tapestries, they tell a condensed visual story of Godric's family. One panel suggests that a member of his line was once celebrated. Another suggests a fall. Godric himself appears in the final panel, stitched into the cloth in a style that looks more frantic than the others, as if whoever made the tapestry was working quickly or under duress. It points toward a noble house in visible decline. Easter egg 10. The Limgrave tunnels, a small mining dungeon in the early game, contain a section where workers' tools are still laid out beside veins of ore, as if the workers simply left mid-shift and never came back. There are no enemies in that particular corner of the dungeon, just tools, ore, and silence. This suggests the developers were thinking about ordinary life in the lands between, about the people who were not warriors or demigods, but who kept the world running, and what happened to them when things fell apart. Easter egg 11. The chest in Dragonburnt Ruins, near the start of the game, teleports you to Celia Crystal Tunnel in Caelid when opened. This is one of the most famous traps in the game. But what many players miss is that the chest is guarded by enemies who are suspiciously easy to defeat, and the area around it is conspicuously clear. The developers seem to have designed the encounter to look like a reward for clearing a small challenge, making the trap feel earned rather than arbitrary. It suggests the placement was carefully considered as a teaching moment about complacency. Easter egg 12. Caelid itself, the rot-blasted region of the game, has a visual design that suggests it was once a lush and fertile land. If you look at the silhouettes of the terrain and compare the elevation map to other areas, Caelid's geography closely mirrors Limgrave's in structure. The rivers, the cliff lines, the placement of ruins. This points toward the idea that Caelid and Limgrave were once part of a unified landscape before the scarlet rot tore the region apart. Easter egg 13. General Radon's castle in Caelid is called Redmane Castle. The Redmane is an obvious reference to Radon's iconic red hair, which is itself a reference to his lineage and his claim to power. But the castle's design also incorporates leonine motifs throughout its architecture, including carvings that look like lion faces above doorways and along staircases. This suggests the developers were drawing on real-world heraldry traditions where noble houses incorporated animal imagery into their architecture to communicate their values and their power. Easter egg 14. Radon himself is known for his love of his horse, Leonard. The horse has been kept alive through the use of gravity magic, so that Radan's enormous body does not crush it. This detail is delivered quietly through item descriptions and is easy to miss if you're not reading carefully. It suggests that beneath Radan's terrifying exterior is a person who cared deeply about something small and specific. The horse is tiny compared to Radahan. He essentially uses magic to keep a beloved companion alive so that he never has to be without it. It is one of the more unexpectedly touching details in a game full of horror. Easter egg 15. When you find Leonard during the Radan festival before the boss fight, the horse is wandering the beach. He will let you approach and feed him. His item description notes that he has learned to eat when food is offered, because Radan can no longer do it for him. This small line suggests that even in Radan's madness, whatever bond existed between them was strong enough that Leonard remained near his master. The developers could have placed the horse anywhere, but they put it near Radan's arena, waiting. Easter egg 16. The Radan festival itself, the event where warriors gather not to defeat a threat, but to give a worthy fighter a meaningful death, has a real-world parallel in certain historical and mythological traditions, where the only fitting end for a legendary warrior was an equally legendary opponent. The festival is framed as an honor, not a mercy killing. This suggests the game is asking the player to sit with a genuinely uncomfortable, ethical question about what it means to be the one who delivers that ending. Easter egg 17. Blood the Half-Wolf is one of the most beloved NPCs in the game. His name in Welsh means wolf. This is not a coincidence. Welsh mythology has a rich tradition of figures who exist between the human and the animal, and Blard's storyline explores exactly that tension. He is loyal to his master Rani, but his nature as a shadow made from wolves ultimately reasserts itself. The name was almost certainly chosen with that mythological tradition in mind. Easter egg 18. Blade's armor, when you obtain it, has a description that refers to it as something worn by a warrior who loved his master above all else. The word loved is used directly, not implied. This is unusual for From Software game item descriptions, which tend to a more clinical language. The choice to use that specific word suggests the writers wanted to be unambiguous about the nature of Blade's devotion to Rani, even as the rest of the game leaves so much else to interpretation. Easter egg 19. Rani the witch has 4 arms. 2 are her own, and 2 belong to the doll body she inhabits. The doll itself is a fascinating design choice. If you look closely at the doll's proportions, they are slightly off compared to the realistic human proportions of other characters. She is too long in the torso and too delicate in the limbs. This suggests the developers designed Rani's doll form to feel subtly uncanny, reinforcing the idea that what you are looking at is not quite human, even as she speaks and reasons like a person. Easter egg 20. Rani's questline involves recovering a treasure called the Fingerslayer Blade. The name alone is remarkable. In a game where the greater will communicates through fingers and finger readers, a blade designed to slay fingers is a weapon designed specifically to defy the ruling cosmic power. This suggests that Rani's rebellion is not metaphorical but literal, and that the developers chose to encode that rebellion directly into the name of the weapon at the center of her plan. Easter egg 21. The Nokron Eternal City, which you access by completing a portion of Radan's encounter, is a city frozen in a moment of celebration. There are NPCs in stone who appear to be dancing. Lanterns are still lit. Tables are set as if for a feast. The city was clearly struck by some catastrophic event mid-celebration. This suggests the developers were drawing on the visual language of Pompeii, where everyday life was preserved mid-action by sudden disaster, and asking the player to read the story of an entire civilization from the postures of its frozen dead. Easter egg 22. The finger reader, Inia, the NPC who exchanges remembrances for unique weapons, has dialogue that subtly changes depending on how many remembrances you have traded with her. She becomes slightly more familiar, slightly more casual, as if she's warming up to you over time. This is easy to miss because players often visit her in bursts rather than one remembrance at a time. It suggests the developers coded in a relationship arc for a character many players treat as purely transactional. Easter egg 23. The walking mausoleum mechanic, where you must strike the white barnacle-like growths on the legs of roaming stone giants to make them kneel and grant you access to a duplicate remembrance, has a visual detail that many players miss. The growths have tiny symbols carved into them. Those symbols match symbols found in the Erd tree's architecture. This points toward a lore connection suggesting the mausoleums were built using the same divine power source as the Erd tree itself. Easter egg 24. The tree sentinel, the imposing golden knight on horseback, who patrols the opening area and is clearly beyond the player's starting capabilities, carries a weapon called the halberd. But his shield, the golden great shield, has a description that references the defense of the Erd tree's outer perimeter. This suggests the tree sentinel's patrol route in the opening area is not random, but represents an actual post, an assigned responsibility, meaning this knight has been circling that area faithfully since receiving that assignment, which may have been a very long time ago. Easter egg 25. There is a dungeon called the Murkwater Cave in Limgrave. Inside it, you are invaded by an NPC named Patches. Patches is a recurring character across multiple From Software games. He appears in Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and now Elden Ring, always playing essentially the same role. He is a scoundrel who traps you, and then, when he realizes you survived, pivots to trying to be your friend and set up shop. The developers have essentially created a beloved recurring villain-turned-comic character who exists across multiple universes. The community treats each Patch's appearance as a reunion. Easter egg 26. Patch's item description for his armor notes that he has survived so many encounters through cowardice and cunning that the armor itself seems to have absorbed some of his luck. This is a joke, but it also doubles as a character summary. Patches is not a fighter, and he never pretends to be. His defining trait across every game he appears in is his survival instinct, and the game treats that as worthy of comment rather than contempt. There is something quietly admirable about a character who is consistently honest about what he is. Easter egg 27. The Knight Bernal, a warrior who invades you at multiple points in the game, is connected to the Volcano Manor questline. His armor description contains a line that suggests he once served a lord he respected, which he no longer serves, and that the memory of that lord is what keeps him moving. This points toward a backstory the game never explicitly delivers, a man who lost something that mattered and has been filling that absence with violence ever since. Easter egg 28. Volcano Manor itself, which is run by a character called Tanith, and her consort Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, is designed to look welcoming on the outside. The building's facade is warm stone with decorated archways. This visual design seems deliberate. It suggests the developers wanted the manor to read as inviting before revealing what actually happens inside, which is that guests are encouraged to become assassins, and the Lord of the Manor has fused himself with a god-devouring serpent. Easter egg 29. Rykard's second phase, which begins when you defeat his snake form and he reveals his true nature, is accompanied by a music track that incorporates what sounds like a distorted choir. The choir element, buried under layers of noise and horror, points toward Rykard's original divine nature. He was once a demigod of the golden lineage. The music seems to be reminding you of that, using familiar, divine-sounding instrumentation under the monstrous surface. Easter egg 30. The blasphemous blade, Rykard's remembrance weapon, regenerates a small amount of health with each kill. This ability is not incidental. Rykard built his power on the consumption of other beings. His weapon continues that pattern. It suggests the developers were thinking about how a weapon might inherit the philosophical framework of its creator. To use the blasphemous blade is to participate, in a small way, in Rykard's worldview. Easter egg 31. Tanith, Rykard's loyal servant, can be found after his defeat in a state of mourning that gradually becomes something else entirely. If you revisit her enough times after the battle, she is eating Rykard's remains. Her dialogue at this point is calm and matter-of-fact. She explains that she intends to take him inside herself. This mirrors Rykard's own philosophy of consumption and devotion in a way that feels like the developers were drawing a clear parallel. Tanith's grief and her lord's theology have become the same thing. Easter egg 32. The Lands Between has a number of locations that appear to be mirrors or echoes of each other. The layout of the Roundtable Hold, the hub area where players can meet NPCs and manage their equipment, strongly resembles the layout of the Firelink Shrine from Dark Souls. Both feature a central fire, corridors branching outward to various characters, and a descending staircase to a more dangerous area. This suggests the developers were deliberately calling back to an earlier hub design while adapting it to Elden Ring's specific context. Easter egg 33. The two fingers, the divine intermediaries through which the greater will communicates in the Lands Between, are visually based on a specific gesture used in medieval Christian iconography to represent benediction or divine blessing. The raised two-finger blessing is one of the most recognizable religious symbols in European art history. The developers took a gesture associated with blessing and made it the physical form of the cosmic authority overseeing the game's world. This points toward a deliberate engagement with religious iconography as visual shorthand. Easter egg 34. The three fingers, the counterpart to the two fingers, and the source of the frenzied flame have an entirely different visual language. Where the two fingers suggest order and benediction, the three fingers are broken, misshapen, and associated with fire and chaos. They can only be reached by stripping yourself of your armor and equipment, meaning you must arrive vulnerable and bare. This suggests the developers designed the encounter to feel like an act of surrender rather than a discovery. Easter egg 35. The Frenzied Flame questline, if followed to its conclusion, results in an ending where the Lands Between is consumed by fire and everyone in it dies. But the item description for the Frenzied Flame itself suggests this is not malicious. It reads as though the flame genuinely believes it is solving a problem by destroying the container. There is a kind of broken compassion in it. The developers seem to have been interested in the idea of an apocalyptic force that thinks it is helping. Easter egg 36. Hieta, the NPC associated with the Frenzied Flame questline, asks you repeatedly for Shabriri grapes as part of her journey toward becoming a finger reader for the three fingers. The grapes are described as the extracted eyes of those afflicted by frenzy. Hieta is blind. She does not know what she's eating. The developers let this detail sit there without comment, letting the player come to the realization on their own. It is one of the more quietly disturbing moments in a game that is rarely quiet about its horror. Easter egg 37. Shabriri, the demon associated with the Frenzied Flame, takes over the body of Yura, a hunter NPC who has been helping you throughout the early and mid-game. When this happens, Shabriri speaks in Yura's voice, but with different cadence and vocabulary. The voice acting for this moment is subtle enough that some players do not immediately realize Yura has been replaced. This suggests the developers were interested in the horror of possession as something gradual and hard to detect, rather than something obvious. Easter egg 38. Yura himself, before his possession, is hunting a specific dragon. His dialogue across multiple encounters tells a story of a man who's been pursuing the same target for a very long time and knows he is probably not going to succeed. There is a weariness in how he talks about it that the developers chose not to make melodramatic. He is just tired. That specific emotional register, exhaustion without self-pity, makes him one of the more memorable minor characters in the game. Easter egg 39. The underground area called Siofra River has a night sky. This is strange because Siofra River is underground. The sky is artificial, a ceiling decorated with stars that do not move and never change. This visual detail suggests that the civilization that built Siofra River tried to recreate the sky it had lost when it was driven underground. The developers placed a false sky in an underground world and let it stand as an entire civilization's worth of longing without ever saying so directly. Easter egg 40. The ancestral spirit boss found in Siofra River by lighting a series of braziers is a massive spectral deer. The deer's design draws from real-world traditions of the stag as a symbol of the spirit world, found in Celtic, Norse, and Siberian shamanic traditions. The boss is not aggressive until provoked, and its attacks feel more defensive than offensive. This points toward the idea that the ancestral spirit is not a guardian of treasure, but a guardian of something more abstract. Perhaps he's the memory of the world that existed before the current one. Easter egg 41. There is an NPC in Siofra River called D, Hunter of the Dead, or specifically his twin brother, who shares the name. Their story, told across multiple questlines and conversations, is about two brothers who are fundamentally different from each other, despite looking identical. One becomes a knight of faith. The other follows a darker path. The developers seem to have been drawing on the twin archetype as a way of exploring how the same origin can lead to entirely different outcomes. Easter egg 42. The Crucible Knight enemies, found in various locations and also appearing as a boss, are named after the Crucible, which is the primordial state of the Eod tree before it became what it is in the game's present. Their design incorporates animalistic features, including tails and fins and crests, that do not appear on modern humans, suggesting that the beings created in the Crucible were a different kind of life than what exists now. The developers seem to have been thinking about evolution and how a dominant civilization might look back on its own evolutionary history with pride, horror, or reverence. Easter egg 43. The Crucible Knight's armor description notes that the tail and wing features are signs of honor, not mutation, within the tradition that venerates the Crucible. This reframes what looks from the outside like body horror as something that is internally understood as beauty. The developers built in a reminder that the game's aesthetic categories of monstrous and noble are cultural rather than inherent. Easter egg 44. Godwyn the Golden, the first of the demigods to die, is described repeatedly in lore as the most beloved of Marika's children. His name literally means golden god in Old English. He was killed by Ranni as part of a plan to break the cycle of the Elden Ring, but the method of his death, his soul was killed while his body lived, resulted in something unprecedented. His deathless body grew, spreading across the roots of the Eod tree, and eventually corrupting the sea near Stormvale Castle. This event, called the Deathroot phenomenon, suggests the developers were interested in what happens when the natural process of dying is broken at its most fundamental level. Easter egg 45. Prince of Death's pustule, an item associated with Godwyn's corruption, has a description that refers to the pustule as almost alive. The item wiggles slightly in the menu. This animation detail, subtle enough that players often do not notice it for many hours of gameplay, suggests the developers wanted to communicate that the corruption spreading from Godwyn is not dead matter, but something actively growing, something that has its own momentum. Easter egg 46. Fia, the deathbed companion, is one of the most discussed NPCs in the game. She offers to hold you, which gives you a small negative effect on your maximum health, but also gives you an item associated with death. The game presents this as a choice without judging either option. Some players accept every time, some never do. This binary feels deliberate. The developers seem to have been thinking about how people respond differently to the offer of comfort when there is a cost attached. Easter egg 47. Effia's questline eventually reveals that she is working toward an ending where Godwyn, or something that calls itself Godwyn, is properly buried and mourned. She wants death to be meaningful again in a world where it has become complicated. This goal is sympathetic in a way that her means sometimes are not. The developers built a character whose emotional motivation is immediately understandable, even as her methods raise questions. Easter egg 48. The item called Fia's robe has a scent description embedded in its lore text. Item descriptions in Elden Ring do not typically include sensory details beyond the visual. The fact that Fia's robe is described as smelling a certain way suggests the writers were trying to make her feel more present, more physical than the game's other NPCs. It is an unusual choice that points toward a deliberate attempt to make her feel intimate. Easter egg 49. The deep-root depths, the underground area where Godwyn's body has spread, is one of the most quietly disturbing areas in the game. The architecture of the Erd tree roots, growing through the ruins of what was once a populated area, suggests a slow encroachment over time, rather than a sudden catastrophe. Some of the roots have grown through walls in ways that suggest they took years to reach their current size. The developers built a space that communicates a long, slow disaster rather than a quick one. Easter egg 50. There is a giant seated figure in the deep-root depths called the Elden Lord Godfrey, appearing as a spectral shade. When you defeat this shade and speak to him, his dialogue is brief and measured. He does not monologue. He simply speaks as a warrior who knows his time is done. The restraint in his characterization at this point in the game, after so many hours of elaborate boss introductions, feels like a deliberate choice by the developers to let a significant character exist in understatement. Easter egg 51. Godfrey, first Elden Lord, the final boss of the Stormveil Legacy dungeon, and later a proper boss fight, has a tattoo of a golden lion across his chest and back. This tattoo is described in item lore as something he received after being stripped of grace, the divine favour that once made him worthy. The tattoo replaced what grace left behind. This suggests the developers were thinking about how people mark themselves in the absence of something they have lost, and what that marking means. Easter egg 52. Huaralu, the second phase identity of Godfrey, represents his true self beneath the Elden Lord persona. The name Huaralu sounds deliberately rough compared to Godfrey, all hard consonants and open vowels. When he reveals this identity, he abandons his weapon and fights with his bare hands. The phase change is one of the most discussed boss moments in the game, partly because the tonal shift is so dramatic. The developers seem to have been interested in what it looks like when a person who has spent years performing a role drops the performance. Easter egg 53. The boss fog gate for Godfrey in Leyndell is one of the most architecturally dramatic in the game. You approach it through a long corridor lined with what appear to be golden knights standing in vigil. They do not move or attack. They are simply there. This staging suggests the developers were thinking about ceremony, about how the approach to something significant should feel different from the rest of the world. The silent knights create a procession that the player walks through, making the boss encounter feel like a ritual rather than a fight. Easter egg 54. Leyndell, the royal capital, is built around the trunk of the Erd tree. The city's architecture follows the curve of the trunk with streets that wrap around it and buildings that use the roots as foundations. If you look at the city's layout from above, it forms a roughly circular pattern centered on the Erd tree. This design suggests the developers were thinking about how a real civilization would organize itself around a sacred object, the way medieval European cities organized themselves around cathedrals. Easter egg 55. The Golden Order Fundamentalist Armor set, found in Leyndell, has a description that references the theological framework of the Yrd tree in terms that closely parallel real-world monotheistic theology. The language of the Golden Order about grace and the favour of the Yrd tree and the Elden Ring as a cosmic law is structured like a religion rather than a government. The developers seem to have drawn consciously on religious history to give the Golden Order a texture that feels lived in rather than invented for the game. Easter egg 56. There is a rooftop in Leyndell where, if you take a specific path up through the city, you find a dead eagle beside a nest. The nest contains no eggs. The eagle is posed as if it died protecting something that was already gone. This small tableau, which most players never find, seems to have no lore significance. It is just a detail placed by a designer who is thinking about what the city's rooftops would look like if you actually lived there, and what kinds of small tragedies might accumulate in out-of-the-way places. Easter egg 57. The capital city contains a giant arrow embedded in one of the outer walls of the Yrd tree. The arrow is enormous, far larger than anything a human could fire. Its design matches the arrows used by giants. This single detail, never directly referenced in any item description or dialogue, implies an entire historical military campaign where giants attacked the capital with siege weapons of this scale. The developers placed physical evidence of a war the player never sees. Easter egg 58. Malenia, Blade of Miquella, is widely considered the hardest boss in the game. Her name, Malenia, contains the Latin root malum, meaning evil or bad, which is also the root of words like malignant. Her twin brother's name, Miquella, comes from the name Michael, an angelic name associated with protection and mercy. The developers seem to have chosen names for these twins that encode their opposing natures, one associated with corruption and one with mercy from the very beginning. Easter egg 59. Malenia's rot flower, the Scarlet Aeonia, blooms when she dies in her second phase. The bloom is what created Caelid. This is delivered as item lore rather than in-game narration. Many players who have fought Malenia do not know that the boss they defeated was personally responsible for one of the game's most visually striking and horrible regions. The developers chose to reveal this connection quietly through a description read after the fact, rather than dramatizing it. Easter egg 60. Malenia heals with every hit she lands, even if the hit is blocked. This mechanic is controversial among players, but it has a lore basis. Her item description suggests that her cursed nature drives her to consume in order to sustain herself, much like the scarlet rot she carries. The developers built her primary mechanic around her lore, rather than designing the lore to justify a gameplay decision. This alignment between story and system is one of the more elegant design choices in the game. Easter egg 61. The painting questline in Elden Ring involves finding a series of landscape paintings in various locations, and then finding the physical location each painting depicts. When you find the right spot, a spirit appears briefly and thanks you. This questline has no combat and no item reward for most of its steps. It exists purely as an exploration puzzle where the reward is the recognition of a place you have already been. The developers seem to have wanted to create moments where knowledge of the world is itself the currency. Easter egg 62. One of the paintings, called the Homing Instinct painting, leads you to a cliff in Eastern Limgrave. The spirit who appears there is an artist. Before he fades, he looks out at the view one more time. The view is the Weeping Peninsula and a distant stretch of ocean. It is genuinely beautiful by the game's visual standards. The developers created a moment where an NPC's emotional state is communicated entirely through where they choose to stand. Easter egg 63. The Weeping Peninsula, the area south of Limgrave, is named for the rain that falls there constantly. The rain is audible throughout the area. If you spend time in the region, the persistent sound of rain becomes part of how the area feels emotionally. The developers used weather as a character note rather than just a visual effect. Constant rain communicates something about a place that visual design alone cannot. Easter egg 64. Castle Morn, found at the southern tip of the Weeping Peninsula, is the site of a servant rebellion. The servants rose up against the castle's ruling class and killed most of them. The lord of the castle, Edgar, stayed to protect a sword that belonged to his daughter. His daughter, Irina, is found outside the castle, blind and frightened. The developer seems to have built an entire family tragedy out of 3 figures spread across a small region, connected by letters and items, and a weapon that one of them is too far away to ever retrieve. Easter egg 65. Irina gives you a letter to deliver to her father. If you deliver it, Edgar reads it quietly and thanks you and says nothing more. His dialogue at this point is minimal. What the letter says is never read aloud. The developers left the content of that letter to the imagination, which makes the moment of delivery heavier than it might otherwise have been. You do not know what you carried. Easter egg 66. The demi-human enemies found throughout the lands between appear primitive and animalistic on first encounter. But if you look at their camps and shelters, they have furniture. They have arranged their spaces. There are items that look like they serve decorative rather than purely practical purposes. This suggests the developers designed the demi-humans as a civilization in an early stage, rather than as purely feral creatures, which adds a layer of discomfort to fighting them. Easter egg 67. The Liurnia of the Lakes region, which opens after Stormvale Castle, contains an enormous body of water that covers what was once land. The ruins of buildings are visible beneath the surface of the lake. If you look carefully, the ruins form street patterns, suggesting the lake flooded what was once a city. The developers built an entire sunken city, visible from above, a ghost landscape beneath the water that communicates the scale of whatever disaster filled this region. Easter egg 68. The Academy of Raya Lucaria, which sits in the middle of Liurnia, is built on an island surrounded by the lake. Its design is loosely based on real-world European Gothic academic architecture, with pointed archways, high ceilings, and decorative stonework. The choice to model an institution of magical learning on real-world academic architecture suggests the developers wanted Raya Lucaria to feel like a place where tradition and hierarchy are inseparable, which is consistent with how the institution behaves in the game's lore. Easter egg 69. The seal on the main entrance of Raya Lucaria is maintained by a magic ring. That ring is a great rune. The key to getting through the seal is another item found in the world. Many players use a walkthrough to find this item, never discovering it organically. But if you follow the item trail in order, the clues connect in a way that suggests the developers designed the path to the Academy as a puzzle solvable through careful exploration rather than prior knowledge. Easter egg 70. Sorcerer Rogier, an NPC found in Stormvale Castle and later at the Round Table Hold, is slowly dying from exposure to the Deathroot corruption. His questline is easy to miss entirely because it unfolds slowly and requires returning to him at intervals. By the time most players realize what is happening, he may already be in the later stages of his decline. This suggests the developers wanted his story to feel like something that happened while you were not paying attention, which mirrors how loss often actually works. Easter egg 71. Rogier's questline connects to Fia's questline, connects to Dee's questline, in a chain of events that the game never announces as connected. Players who followed all 3 questlines discovered the connections through the community. The developers built an interlocking narrative structure that rewarded players who talked to everyone repeatedly and who compared notes across questlines that seemed unrelated. Easter egg 72. The Three Sisters area of Liurnia, where Rani's Tower is located, is surrounded by sleeping dragons. They are alive but motionless. You can walk past them if you're careful. The dragons react if attacked but do not patrol or threaten. This design creates a very specific feeling, like walking through a graveyard where the graves might wake up. The developers place living things in a posture of death and let the tension of that coexist with the need to traverse the area. Easter egg 73. Caria Manor, which guards the path to the Three Sisters area, is a castle run by the Carian royal family and populated by enormous spider-like hands. These enemies are disturbing by design. The hand motif connects to the two fingers and three fingers imagery elsewhere in the game. The developers seem to have been working with hands as a recurring symbol of power and cosmic authority, and the spider hands in Caria Manor suggest a divine power that has become grotesque through overgrowth. Easter egg 74. Royal Knight Loretta, the boss of Caria Manor, is shown in a cutscene riding a spectral horse through the manor's garden. The garden is beautiful, full of white flowers and blue light. Before she becomes a target, she is simply a knight riding through a garden. The developers chose to show her doing something peaceful before making her a boss encounter, which gives the fight a different quality than encounters where the boss is immediately threatening. Easter egg 75. Loretta appears again as a boss in Haligtree, Miquella's unfinished secret tree, in a more powerful form called Loretta, Knight of the Haligtree. The fact that she serves at both locations suggests she was assigned to protect the things that mattered most to the Carian royal family, and later transferred her loyalty to Miquella's project. Her second appearance rewards players who remember her from Caria Manor with a sense of continuity. Easter egg 76. The Haligtree itself is one of the most beautifully strange environments in the game. It is described as a tree Miquella attempted to grow as an alternative to the Erd tree, one that would be free from the Greater Will's influence. Its design is warmer in colour palette than the Erd tree, with more organic curvature in its architecture. The developers seem to have designed the Haligtree to feel aspirational, like something that almost became something wonderful before it was abandoned. Easter egg 77. Elfale, the brace of the Haligtree, is the settlement built around and within the Haligtree. Its name sounds almost tender. To brace something is to support it, to keep it upright when it might otherwise fall. The name suggests the settlement existed to hold the tree up, to be its living scaffolding. The developers chose a word that encodes a relationship of devotion. Easter egg 78. In the Haligtree, there are Albinauric residents who fled there from the persecution they faced elsewhere, in the lands between. The Albinaurics are a created people, not born naturally, and they are treated by the game's other factions as lesser. The Haligtree is described as a refuge. Miquella apparently welcomed them. This lore, delivered quietly through item descriptions and enemy types, suggests the developers built a political context for why certain beings ended up in certain places, rather than populating areas randomly. Easter egg 79. The Finger Maiden Thea, a character in Miquella's story, was one of those who chose to follow him into the Haligtree. Her item description describes her as someone who believed completely in Miquella's vision. This kind of absolute faith in a person rather than an institution is relatively rare in the game's characterization. Most characters' loyalty is complicated by something. Thea's seems not to be, and that simplicity makes her one of the more poignant figures in a storyline full of tragedy. Easter egg 80. Miquella himself is never seen as an active character in the base game. He appears only as a sleeping figure in a cocoon and is visible only briefly. Everything you learn about him comes through the memories and testimonies of others. The developers built an entire character out of his absence, letting the devotion of those around him tell his story rather than letting him speak for himself. It is a notable structural choice that makes him feel mythological. Easter egg 81. The item called Miquella's Needle, used to reverse the frenzied flame ending, has a description that refers to it as something Miquella crafted to help someone he cared about. This needle is associated with millennia. It suggests that Miquella spent years trying to find a cure for his sister's scarlet rot condition, and that the needle represents his best attempt. The developers built a sibling relationship, defined by one trying everything possible to help the other, and then placed the evidence of that effort in a throwable item. Easter egg 82. The consecrated snowfield, the hidden region accessed through a secret passage in the mountaintops of the giants, has a blizzard that severely limits visibility. In the blizzard, you can barely see more than a few feet ahead. The developers placed enemies and traps and items in this near-zero visibility environment, trusting players to move slowly and carefully. The weather is a gameplay mechanic rather than just atmosphere, which suggests the developers thought carefully about how environment shapes player behavior. Easter egg 83. There is a frozen river in the consecrated snowfield. Beneath the ice, if you look down, you can see what appear to be structures, buildings frozen under the river. The visual is not highlighted by the game at all. There is no item or NPC pointing to it. It is just there, a detail visible if you pause and look at the ground rather than the horizon. The developers placed an entire archaeological discovery under the ice and then did not mention it. Easter egg 84. The mountaintops of the Giants region is where the fire giants live. The fire giants are the last surviving members of a race that the Elden Lord Godfrey is said to have nearly wiped out in service of Marika. The surviving giant was blinded and had its legs shackled so it could not move. It was then left to tend an eternal flame. The developers built a mythology of genocide into the backstory of a boss encounter, making the fire giants simultaneously a monster and a victim. Easter egg 85. The fire giant's weakness is its ankle. This is a direct reference to the myth of Achilles, whose single vulnerability was his heel. The developers embedded a classical mythological reference into the boss's mechanical design, so that players who know the myth understand why the ankle is where it is even before the game shows them. Easter egg 86. Farum Azula, the crumbling stone city floating in a perpetual storm, is one of the most visually distinct areas in the game. Its architecture is not consistent with anything else in the lands between. Everything about it suggests it comes from a different civilization and possibly a different time. Item descriptions in the area refer to a forgotten age. The developers designed an entire location as an artifact from a period of history that has been deliberately erased. Easter egg 87. Malekith, the Black Blade, is found in Farum Azula and is revealed to be Marika's shadow, a being created to serve and protect her. He carries the Rune of Death, which Marika extracted from the Elden Ring and gave to him to conceal. His presence in Farum Azula suggests he was sent there to keep the Rune of Death as far from the rest of the world as possible. The developers built the physical distance of the location into the lore. Easter egg 88. The Black Blade weapon associated with Malekith has a skill called Destined Death, which deals damage that cannot be prevented by the Great Rune of the Unborn or other resurrection mechanics. It kills permanently. In a game where death is complicated and often reversible, a weapon that kills absolutely is an extraordinary thing. The developers seem to have been thinking about the concept of true death in a world that has largely lost it. Easter egg 89. Gurranq, Beast Clergyman, an NPC found in Farum Azula, is the same entity as Malekith before his transformation. This connection is discovered through questline events and is one of the more significant reveals in the game. Players who engaged with Gurranq's questline and brought him Deathroot fragments throughout the game then encounter this same figure as a major boss. The developers built a long relationship arc across the game and then paid it off in a final encounter that recontextualizes everything that came before. Easter egg 90, the Elden Beast, the final boss of the base game, is the physical, form of the Elden Ring itself, or more accurately, the physical form of the greater will's intention within the Elden Ring. It is a creature made of stars and lore. Its visual design includes constellations visible on its body. If you pause and look at the constellation patterns, they appear to match star patterns referenced in the game's in-universe astronomical traditions. The developers built a cosmological map into the final boss's body. Easter egg 91. The arena for the Elden Beast fight is a golden mist sea. There is no ground. You fight on the surface of light itself. The visual design of this arena is unlike any other fight in the game, and it seems deliberate. Every other boss exists in a physical space. The Elden Beast exists in something that transcends physical space. The developers used the arena design to communicate the nature of what you're fighting. Easter egg 92. After defeating the Elden Beast, the ending cutscenes play. There are multiple endings, and each one uses the same visual language of the Erd tree and the broken world being remade or abandoned in different ways. The developers built one set of animation assets and wrote multiple voiceover scripts, using the same images to communicate entirely different conclusions depending on the player's choices. This economy of visual language is one of the more sophisticated storytelling choices in the game. Easter egg 93. The Elden Ring itself, as an object, is never directly seen in the game. You see its shards, the great runes. You see the Elden Beast, its physical manifestation. But the Elden Ring as a complete object is described but never shown. This absence is almost certainly deliberate. The developers built the entire game around recovering and repairing something that is never directly presented to the player, which is a remarkably restrained choice. Easter egg 94. The name Elden Ring itself has been interpreted in multiple ways. Elden may derive from the Old English word Eld, meaning old, giving you old ring or ancient ring. It may also connect to the concept of the elder, the ruling or primordial. The word ring carries obvious connotations of cyclical structure, of binding, and of a group. The developers gave the game a title that can be read as an ancient covenant, an old cycle, or a binding law depending on how you approach it. Easter egg 95. The starting class. Knight begins with an armour set that closely resembles the armour worn by Godfrey, first Elden Lord, in his early depictions. This suggests that the Knight class is intended as a callback to the founding era of the Lands Between, when Godfrey's model of the armoured warrior lord was the dominant ideal. Players who choose Knight are unknowingly stepping into a visual legacy. Easter egg 96. The Wretch starting class begins with nothing but a club. The Wretch is the only starting class with no armour, no secondary weapon, no special items. It exists at the extreme end of a difficulty spectrum the game offers, without explaining. Players who choose Wretch are essentially telling the game they want to start from zero. The developers built a class that communicates a specific relationship with challenge, but they also named it Wretch, which suggests something about how the world perceives those who begin from nothing. Easter egg 97. The astrologer starting class begins with a staff and a spell called Glintstone Pebble. The staff's design is slim and plain, nothing like the elaborate staves you find later in the game. The contrast between where the astrologer starts and where sorcery can go is enormous, and the developers seem to have designed the class so that the progression feels earned. When you acquire a truly powerful staff, you remember the plain one you started with. Easter egg 98. The prophet starting class is described in its lore as someone who sees visions of the Elden Ring's fate. The class begins with healing items. It is the only starting class equipped primarily for support. The developers built a class whose philosophical orientation toward prophecy and healing is reflected in its starting equipment rather than just its lore description. Easter egg 99. The samurai starting class is the only one that begins with a long-range weapon, a short bow with arrows. The design of the class draws from Japanese historical warrior traditions in obvious ways, but the inclusion of the bow suggests the developers were thinking about the historical reality of samurai combat, in which the bow was as important as the sword, rather than the Hollywood version, where the katana is primary. Easter egg 100. The Vagabond starting class is the one statistically recommended for new players. Its name means wanderer, which is essentially what every player is from the beginning, and what every tarnished is by definition. The developers named the beginner class after the condition shared by all player characters, which is a quiet joke that also doubles as accurate description. Easter egg 101. The prisoner starting class wears an iron mask over the upper half of its face. The item description of the mask notes that it is used to contain something. This suggests the prisoner was imprisoned not as punishment but as containment, which implies the prisoner has something in them that needs to be held in. This ambiguity, prisoner of what, contained how, for whose safety, is never resolved. The developers gave this class a mystery baked into its starting appearance. Easter egg 102. There is a character called Iron Fist Alexander, a jar warrior who you encounter multiple times across the game. He is an enormous ceramic jar shaped like a person, and he fills himself with the remains of powerful warriors to absorb their strength. He is cheerful and optimistic, and one of the most beloved NPCs in the game. His presence in a game about cosmic tragedy and divine warfare is clearly tonal counterbalancing. The developers seem to have designed him to give players somewhere to rest emotionally between difficult moments. Easter egg 103. Alexander's questline ends for most players in a duel where he asks you to fight him at his peak so that he can be filled with a worthy champion's remains, meaning yours in the tradition of the powerful warriors he has collected. He does not ask you to kill him as a mercy. He asks you to fight him because he believes a death in a good fight is the best death. The developers gave a comedic character a genuinely moving final questline that is tonally consistent with the darkest parts of the game. Easter egg 104. Little Jar, a smaller jar person encountered in Alexander's early questline, refers to Alexander as her father. Alexander is embarrassed by this. This domestic comedy beat, a cheerful giant jar being called Dad by a smaller jar, happens in the middle of a dungeon and requires talking to a tiny jar by the side of a road. The developers placed this exchange in an entirely optional location with no gameplay reward. It exists purely for the players who look. Easter egg 105. The Jar Village, a location in Altus Plateau, is populated entirely by jar warriors of various sizes. They are peaceful. They do not attack. Walking through the Jar Village without provoking anyone reveals that the Jar people have a community, a home, and presumably a culture. This small detail asks a quiet question about what the lands between looks like when you stop treating everything as a combat encounter. Easter egg 106. The Altus Plateau itself is reached by one of two routes, either climbing a massive lift or assembling two halves of a medallion found in opposite corners of the world. The medallion route is the kind of quest that requires either following a guide or talking to every NPC and reading every item description carefully. The developers built an entire traversal puzzle into what is, for many players, the transition from the early game to the mid-game. Easter egg 107. The Grand Lift of Dectus, the lift option for reaching Altus Plateau, has murals along its shaft that depict Marika. The murals are not in perfect condition. Some sections have been damaged. This visual detail suggests the lift has been in operation long enough to accumulate wear, and that Marika has been a symbolic figure for long enough to be carved into large public infrastructure. The developers built a suggestion of historical time into the texture of the environment. Easter egg 108. Magma Worm. Maka, a boss encountered near the Grand Lift, is a dragon who has gone mad from consuming magma. Its design is unlike the other dragons in the game, which are generally proud and composed. Makar is frantic, erratic, driven by appetite. The developers seem to have designed this boss as a version of what a dragon becomes when its nature consumes its reason, a cautionary contrast to the great dragons encountered elsewhere. Easter egg 109. The great dragons encountered in the open world, like Agil and Grail and Lanciax, all have names. None of them are explained in any item description. You learn their names only from the achievement or trophy that unlocks when you defeat them, or from community research into datamined files. The developers named creatures that the game itself never introduces, and then left those names findable only through external sources. Easter egg 110. Lanciax, one of the named dragons, is associated with an NPC called Nightburnal and a location connected to the ancient dragon tradition. She appears in 2 locations in the game, both times in a context that suggests she's looking for something or someone. The second location, near a ruined church, has her standing over what appears to be the remnants of a gathering. The developers seem to have given her a purpose and a search without explaining what either of them are. Easter egg 111. The Dragon Lord Placidusax is the secret boss of Farum Azula, found by lying down in a specific wind-scoured location. The boss area must be entered by lying down and allowing yourself to be pulled into it, which is an unusual interaction. The developers designed the most secret major boss in the game to be accessible only through an action that mimics surrender or rest, which is an unusual choice for what turns out to be one of the most spectacular fights in the game. Easter egg 112. Placidusax is described as the Elden Lord before Godfrey, before Marika, before the current age. He served a god that is now forgotten, a god whose name is not given anywhere in the game's text. He has 2 heads, suggesting he originally had 2 gods he served, and one of those heads has lost its face, suggesting one of those gods is now gone. The developers built a tragedy about devotion to something that no longer exists into the visual design of a single boss. Easter egg 113. The music for the Placidusax fight incorporates what sounds like reversed audio at certain points. If you record the music and reverse it, some of the elements resolve into tones that suggest a more conventional, melodic structure underneath the chaos. Whether this is intentional or a result of the composition technique is debated in the community. But the possibility that the music is backwards, like a history playing in reverse, is consistent with Placidusax's nature as a figure from a lost past. Easter egg 114. The Spirit Cooler Cave boss fight involves a Godskin Apostle and a Godskin Noble fighting together. The Godskin enemies elsewhere in the game are solitary. Seeing 2 of them cooperating is unusual, but the more significant detail is that they share a health pool in a specific way. Killing one causes the other to revive, unless the second is defeated quickly. This mechanical detail suggests the 2 are connected in a way that goes beyond simple partnership, pointing toward the idea that the Godskins collectively share something more fundamental than allegiance. Easter egg 115. The Godskin Apostle's armor description refers to the Apostle as a member of a group that hunts gods. This is remarkable language. Hunting gods implies that gods can be hunted, which implies they are mortal in some sense. The developers built a secret society of god hunters into the game's background mythology and delivered most of what we know about them through armor descriptions. Easter egg 116. The Godskin Noble, despite the word noble in its name, is associated with the same tradition as the Apostle. The Noble is the more elaborate of the 2 designs. Where the Apostle is gaunt and elongated, the Noble is round and almost cartoonishly fat. This visual contrast within the same tradition seems to reflect a design philosophy where a group defined by its function, rather than its appearance, encompasses a wide range of physical types. The developers resisted making their monster faction visually uniform. Easter egg 117. Throughout the lands between, there are messages from other players left on the ground. The game's online system allows players to write short notes using a fixed vocabulary. While these messages are player-created rather than developer-placed, the vocabulary available for writing them was chosen by the developers. The inclusion of words like try finger but hole in that vocabulary suggests the developers anticipated and implicitly endorsed a certain kind of community humour. Easter egg 118. The sorcerer Azur and the sorcerer Lusat are two NPCs connected to advanced sorcery questlines. Both of them are found in states of petrification, frozen while performing powerful magic. Azur's petrified pose is dramatic, one hand extended, like someone interrupted mid-cast. Lusat is more collapsed, suggesting he ran out of something before completing whatever he was attempting. The contrast in their poses tells two different stories about how they arrived at the same condition. Easter egg 119. The sorcery called Comet Azur, obtained from the petrified Azur, is one of the most powerful spells in the game. It is a sustained beam of magical energy. Its power is enormous, but casting it requires the player to stand still and channel it, which leaves them completely vulnerable. The developers built the game's strongest early sorcery with a significant practical limitation that forces players to make strategic choices about when to use it, rather than simply rewarding them with power. Easter egg 120. Lusat's Stars of Ruin, obtained through his questline, fires 12 projectiles simultaneously. The number 12 has significance in multiple real-world mythological and astrological traditions. The developers chose 12 specifically. Whether this is a reference to the 12 constellations of the zodiac, the 12 apostles, or the 12 hours of the day is not stated, but the precision of the number in a game built on symbolic language suggests it was chosen deliberately. Easter egg 121. The Graven Skull Talisman, which increases the power of sorceries, depicts a cluster of human faces fused together. The description states that the glintstone sorcerers used to believe that collecting the faces of the dead could accumulate their knowledge. This is a deeply unsettling practice, and the talisman is a reminder that the game's academic tradition of sorcery had a dark history. The developers built horror into what is ostensibly a helpful item. Easter egg 122. The Graven Mass Talisman, a more powerful version of the above, depicts a larger cluster of faces. The visual design escalates from uncomfortable to genuinely disturbing. The developers used the two talismans as a progression, showing not just the escalation of power, but the escalation of the practice that generated that power. More power required more faces. Easter egg 123. The Moonveil Katana, one of the most popular weapons in the game during its initial release, has a skill called Transient Moonlight. The name suggests something temporary and beautiful, which is consistent with the katana's aesthetic identity. But the skill's lore description refers to a moon that rises and sets within a single breath. This is a compressed lyrical statement buried in an item description. The developers seem to have been writing poetry inside the mechanical infrastructure of the game. Easter egg 124. The Dark Moon Greatsword, associated with Ranni's questline, and obtainable only by completing that questline, has a description that refers to it as a symbol of a cold night, the chill of which will never fade. This is the most emotionally direct language used in any weapon description in the game. The sword is a gift from Ranni at the conclusion of her personal story. The developers wrote the item description as if it were an intimate message from her, rather than a factual account of the weapon's properties. Easter egg 125. The Knight's cavalry enemies which patrol roads at night in various regions disappear at dawn. This is not just a mechanic. The item descriptions of their equipment state that they are souls bound to patrol in the dark. They have no choice in the matter. The developers built a tragedy into what could have been a simple day and night gameplay mechanic, giving these enemies a reason for their behavior that makes encountering them feel different. Easter egg 126. The Black Knife Assassin enemies, connected to the assassination of Godwin, wear armor that muffles sound. They were designed to kill silently and leave no evidence. The armor's description refers to the noise of footsteps being swallowed by the cloth. This level of detail in the design of assassin gear suggests the developers thought carefully about what it would actually take to kill a demigod without being caught, and then built those requirements into the armor's properties. Easter egg 127. The assassin's crimson dagger, a talisman associated with the black knife tradition, is described as made from the shards of a blade that was later destroyed to prevent the same assassination from being repeated. The developers built a cover-up into the backstory of a minor talisman. Someone tried to ensure the method of killing could not be used again, and the game notes this obliquely through an item description most players read without fully registering. Easter egg 128. The Blood Oath armor, associated with the Black Knife Assassins, can be worn by the player. Wearing it lets you view the assassination from the perspective of someone aligned with that secret organization. The developers built the player's ability to inhabit different factions' equipment as a form of lore exploration. Wearing the armor of the people who killed Godwin is a different experience of that event than reading about it. Easter egg 129. The walking mausoleum that appears in Liurnia of the Lakes has a bell on its underside. The bell tolls when the mausoleum moves. The sound of the bell can be heard from a significant distance. This design detail means that players navigating Liurnia can hear the mausoleum before they see it, and can track its movement by sound. The developers built audio navigation into an optional resource mechanic. Easter egg 130. The description of the tarnished seal, an item that scales with multiple attributes, mentions that it was used by those who sought to master all traditions rather than committing to one. This is the item associated with hybrid builds. The developers chose to describe a build philosophy in the lore of the item that enables it, implying that this kind of eclecticism has a tradition in the lands between, not just a mechanical function in the game. Easter egg 131. The Flask of Wondrous Physic is a customizable healing item that lets you mix 2 crystal tears for different effects. The flask itself has a description that refers to it as something used by pilgrims making journeys to distant holy sites. This contextualizes the player character's healing routine within the game's religious geography. You are not just using an item, you are performing a pilgrim's ritual. Easter egg 132. The crystal tears used in the Flask of Wondrous Physic are described individually, and several of them reference specific events in the game's history. The Thorny Cracked Tear, for example, mentions that damage dealt with attacks builds up, referencing a mechanic, but its lore describes the thorns as growing from repeated contact with blood, suggesting the tear was formed from a history of violence. The developers seem to have written origin stories for each tier, rather than just gameplay descriptions. Easter egg 133. The Stargazer's ruins, found in the mountaintops of the Giants, contain a chair facing outward from a window with a view of the sky. On the chair are notes. The notes contain astronomical observations, star positions, and movement patterns recorded in careful detail. There is no NPC here. There is only evidence of someone who sat in this chair and looked up for a very long time. The developers built the record of a life's work into a ruin and then moved on. Easter egg 134. The item called Dragon Wound Grease mentions that it was made from the ichor of a dragon's wounds. This implies someone wounded a dragon, collected its ichor, processed it into a grease, and distributed it as a combat supply. The developers built an entire invisible economy of dragon-based materials into the background of the game's world, and this is one of the small details that suggests that economy. Easter egg 135. The Dragon Communion mechanic, where you offer dragon hearts at a cathedral and receive draconic incantations in exchange, has a visual effect where the player's eyes change colour after repeated use. This is noted in certain dialogue lines from NPCs. They comment on your eyes. This subtle character change, visible in the player's appearance menu, suggests the developers wanted to show that repeated Dragon Communion leaves a physical mark. Easter egg 136. The Cathedral of Dragon Communion on the Weeping Peninsula is slightly different from the one in Caelid. The one on the Weeping Peninsula is smaller, older looking, and more accessible. The one in Caelid is larger and sits in a more dramatic location. The developers seem to have designed two versions of the same institution at different scales, suggesting a tradition that spread and grew rather than appearing fully formed. Easter egg 137. The description of the Flame of Frenzy incantation refers to it as a fire that can never be contained once started. This is mechanically true in the sense that the Frenzied Flame questline, once engaged past a certain point, is difficult to reverse. The developers seem to have written the item description as a warning about the questline's commitment mechanics, hiding a practical cautionary note inside a lore description. Easter egg 138. Gideon Ofnir, the all-knowing, the head of the Round Table Hold, has dialogue that seems helpful on the surface, but is consistently steering you away from certain questlines and endings. Players who follow his advice miss significant portions of the game's optional content. Whether this is Gideon being protective, controlling, or actively working against certain outcomes is ambiguous. The developers built a mentor character whose agenda is unclear enough that reasonable players disagree about his motivations. Easter egg 139. Gideon Ofnir becomes a boss in the endgame. His boss form uses spells and abilities associated with the demigods you have already defeated. His title is Gideon Ofnir, the All-Knowing. He literally learned from everything you did because you told him. The developers built a boss fight where the enemy's power comes directly from the player's own reporting throughout the game, which reframes every previous conversation with him. Easter egg 140. The Tarnished Sfurled Finger, an item that allows you to be summoned for cooperative play, has a description that refers to the act of cooperation as something practiced by those who hold fast to each other in the dark. This is one of the more lyrical item descriptions in the game, and it frames the multiplayer mechanic within the game's mythology rather than as a purely external function. The developers wanted multiplayer to feel like it had a reason to exist within the world. Easter egg 141. The competitive invasion mechanic, where players can invade each other's worlds, is justified within the game's lore by the concept of the Bloody Finger, a tool used by those who pursue the power of the Elden Ring through combat with other Tarnished. The developers built a competitive rationale into the item so that PvP invasions feel like something the game's world understands rather than a purely mechanical overlay. Easter egg 142. The Furl-Calling Finger remedy, which reveals the presence of summon signs in your world, has a description that speaks of it as a tool for mending the severed connection between those who wander the same lands. The developers wrote about cooperative multiplayer as an act of reconnection in a world defined by isolation and loss. This frames something as simple as summoning a friend in the language of the game's emotional register. Easter egg 143. The item called Seedbed Curse, associated with Volcano Mana, causes a white plant-like growth to appear on the player's body when equipped. This growth is visible during gameplay and during cutscenes. The developers built a visible player character transformation into an item so that equipping it changes how your character looks in the world. This level of integration between items and visual presentation is unusual. Easter egg 144. The Erd Tree avatar enemies, which guard minor Erd trees throughout the lands between, use a staff topped with a golden flower. When they attack with it, the attacks have a slight delay that mirrors the sway of an actual flower in wind. The animators seem to have given these enemies physically accurate movement for their weapon type, which makes their attacks feel distinct from other staff-wielding enemies in the game. Easter egg 145. The minor Erd trees themselves are described in lore as offshoots of the main Erd tree. They glow gold. They appear throughout the landscape as landmarks. The developers place them at roughly equal visual distances from each other across the map, creating a navigational grid that does not look like a navigational grid. Players using minor Erd trees as landmarks are using the game's religious geography as a mapping system. Easter egg 146. The golden seeds, which upgrade your flask charges, are found beneath minor Erd trees in the form of small seeds on the ground. Their description refers to the seeds as something that hold the potential of the Erd tree's golden light. This frames a mechanical resource as a religious relic, connecting every mechanical upgrade of your healing supply to the game's central theological symbol. Easter egg 147. Sacred tears, the other flask upgrade item, are found inside churches. The description refers to them as tears shed by the statue of Marika in grief. This is a remarkable claim. The golden statues of Marika throughout the lands between are described as having wept, and those tears crystallized into a healing substance. The developers built a cosmology where divine grief is literally medicinal. Easter egg 148. The statues of Marika used in crafting and upgrading have a specific detail that many players notice but fewer investigate. The face of the statue does not quite match the face of the player character Melina, who is sometimes suggested to be connected to Marika. But there are similarities. The developers seem to have built intentional ambiguity into the comparison, rather than making it definitive. Easter egg 149. Melina offers herself as your finger maiden, which in the game's lore means she helps you use sights of grace. But her offer is phrased as a bargain from the beginning. She wants something in return. That something is revealed in the game's endgame. The developers front-loaded an obligation into what looks like a gift, and the terms of that obligation take most of the game to become clear. Easter egg 150. Melina's eyes are asymmetric. One is open, one is closed behind a scarred lid. Her closed eye is described in item lore as a flame. This detail, combined with certain ending implications, suggests the developers were encoding Melina's true nature into her character model in a way that players would only understand in retrospect. Easter egg 151. The Trina's lily flower, associated with Saint Trina and used in crafting sleep-inducing items, has a description that refers to Trina as an enigmatic figure of uncertain gender. This is unusual in a game where most characters are described with conventional gendering. The developers seem to have deliberately made Trina's identity ambiguous, with some lore suggesting Trina may be connected to Michaela, who is also described in connection with androgyny in certain item descriptions. Easter egg 152. The soporific grease, a sleep-inducing consumable, is named with a word that means causing sleep, from the Latin sopor. The developers consistently used etymologically precise language for their items. This suggests a writing team that was thinking carefully about the history of the words they chose, rather than simply finding names that sounded good. Easter egg 153. The tarnished golden sunflower, a cookable crafting item, has a description that contrasts its golden colour with its withered state. This is one of many items in the game that uses beauty and decay in the same breath. The developers seem to have wanted every crafting item to carry some emotional weight, rather than existing purely as a resource. Easter egg 154. The cookbook items that teach you new crafting recipes are associated with specific traditions. The nomadic warrior's cookbook is associated with those who travel light and live off the land. The armorer's cookbook is associated with those who maintain equipment. Each cookbook tradition implies a lifestyle. The developers connected crafting knowledge to way of life rather than to level or progression, suggesting that knowing how to make something tells you something about where you came from. Easter egg 155. There is a cookbook called the Missionary's Cookbook. Missionaries in the game's context are connected to the Golden Order, the ruling religious tradition. Their cookbook contains recipes associated with the faith. The inclusion of a religious tradition's culinary practices in a crafting system is a form of world building that suggests the developers thought about how religion permeates daily life in the lands between, all the way down to how people prepare food. Easter egg 156. The item called Drawstring Sacred Grease has a description that implies it was developed by someone who found the regular version too slow to apply in combat and worked to redesign the delivery method. This is a character who exists only in an item description, an unnamed craftsperson who solved a practical problem. The developers built invisible histories of innovation into their consumable items. Easter egg 157. The Mushroom Armor set, which can be found in Seathwater Cave, has a description that suggests the wearer begins to take on fungal characteristics over time. The visual design of the armor makes this quite apparent. The developers designed armor that implies a process of transformation already underway in the person who wore it, suggesting the armor is less equipment and more symptom. Easter egg 158. The Lamenter's Visage, a helmet associated with the Omen tradition, depicts a face in an expression of anguish. The description notes that the face carved on the mask is that of a human who has become aware of their own nature as an omen, a cursed being marked at birth. This reframes the omen enemies from monsters into people who have been aware of their own damnation from the beginning, and who carry that awareness visibly on their face. Easter egg 159. The omen killer enemies are humans who hunt omens for a living. Their armor contains the remnants of omen kills. The visual design of the omen killer is that of someone who has spent so long hunting monsters that they have begun to look like one. The developers seem to have been thinking about how violence shapes the person who enacts it and built that idea into the visual design of a mid-game enemy type. Easter egg 160. Shabriri's Woe, a talisman that draws enemy aggression toward the player, has a description that explains Shabriri as a figure who has had his eyes gouged out and replaced with madness. The talisman shows his ruined face. The developers built a cautionary figure into the game's accessory system, a person who accumulated so much of the wrong kind of attention that he lost himself entirely, now serving as a magnet for attention, even in death. Easter egg 161. The Vike's War Spear, associated with an invading NPC named Vike, tells his backstory through its description. Vike was once a tarnished who came close to becoming Elden Lord before being consumed by the frenzied flame. His spear shows scorch marks consistent with frenzied flame exposure. The developers built a history of failure, ambition, and corruption into the visual design of a weapon obtained through defeating an enemy who might have been the protagonist of a different playthrough. Easter egg 162. The furl-calling finger remedy, when used, produces a visible effect where a golden pattern briefly appears on the ground. This pattern resembles embroidery. The developers gave a multiplayer tool a beautiful, textile-inspired visual effect rather than something purely functional. The choice suggests they wanted the act of calling for help to look meaningful rather than mechanical. Easter egg 163. The Spirit Spring Jumps, the geysers of air that send Torrent the horse leaping huge distances, are often positioned near areas of lore significance. The spirit spring near the Erd Tree's outer wall launches you to a location where you can view the capital from above. The developers seem to have placed these traversal tools at points where the view from the peak of the jump would tell you something about the geography or history of the area below. Easter egg 164. Torrent, the spectral horse, is given to you by Melina. The game never explains what Torrent is or where he came from. His item description refers to him as a steed who has chosen you and suggests this is not arbitrary. Torrent's prior owner is implied but not confirmed. Multiple theories in the community suggest who Torrent belonged to before the player character. The developers built a mystery into the game's basic traversal mechanic that has never been definitively resolved. Easter egg 165. Torrent can be killed. He does not die permanently. Melina can revive him with a roa raisin. When she does, she says something that implies she finds it difficult to watch. She does not explain why. This brief dialogue exchange in an optional interaction suggests that Melina's relationship with Torrent is more complicated than her role as the one who facilitates his revival would indicate. Easter egg 166. The roa raisin used to revive Torrent is made from roa fruit, which is one of the most common crafting ingredients in the game. The developers made the item that revives your horse something you almost certainly have in abundance. This prevents the revival from being a resource management problem and keeps the focus on the emotional register of having your horse die rather than on the practical consequences. Easter egg 167. The jellyfish spirit ashes, which summon a spectral jellyfish to fight alongside you, come with an item description that refers to the jellyfish as the friend of a lonely young girl who waited for someone who never came. This context, delivered quietly in a spirit ash description, turns a strange combat utility into something unexpectedly sad. The developers seem to have written backstories for spirit summons that reward players who read. Easter egg 168. The lone wolf ashes, one of the most practically useful summons in the game because they summon 3 wolves at once, have a description that refers to the wolves as those who hunt in packs despite their name. The contradiction in the name is intentional. The developers seem to have been making a gentle joke about how the word lone is built into the name of a spirit that is never actually alone. Easter egg 169. The Latenna, the Albinoric spirit ash, is unique among summons in that the NPC Latenna can be found alive before you summon her. Her questline involves escorting her toward the Halig tree, which she hopes to find. When you finally summon her spirit in combat, the context of having carried her toward her goal makes using her as a tool feel different than most other summons. The developers built emotional stakes into a gameplay mechanic by grounding it in a questline. Easter egg 170. The Knight's Cavalry armor description mentions that those who wear it ride out only at night because they have forgotten the sun. This line is unusual in how specific it is. They have not simply been denied the sun or been confined to night. They have forgotten it. This implies a long enough time in darkness to erase the memory of something fundamental. The developers built existential scale into a sentence about an enemy's patrol schedule. Easter egg 171. There are multiple invasion NPCs in the game whose summon signs, used for being called as a helper in a boss fight, appear near the boss fog gate. Several of these characters have questlines that explain why they are willing to help with that specific boss. Nephili Lu, for example, will help you fight Godric because of her personal history with his family. The developers connected the NPC summon mechanic to character motivation wherever they could. Easter egg 172. Nephili Lu is the daughter of Gideon Ofnir. She does not know this at the start of the game. When she finds out, her reaction is not what most players expect. She does not become angry or vengeful. She becomes quieter. The developers gave a revelation moment, a subdued emotional response rather than a dramatic one, which makes it feel more real than a theatrical confrontation would have. Easter egg 173. The Stormhawk Dean, a spirit ash that summons a hawk to fight for you, has a description that mentions it was the companion of a brave warrior from the Stormhawk tradition. This warrior is Nephili Lu. The spirit ash is already hers before you give it to her. When you do give it back, her dialogue registers the reunion with a kind of quiet relief. The developers built a reunion into a spirit ash transaction. Easter egg 174. The item called Deathbed Smalls, associated with fear, is an undergarment that gives a sleep resistance boost. It exists in the game's files. Whether it was meant to be obtainable and was cut from the final game, or is obtainable through a very specific method, is a topic of community discussion. The developers created an item associated with an NPC's intimate clothing and then placed it in the game in an ambiguous state of accessibility. Easter egg 175. The gesture called Extreme Repentance, which involves kneeling and pressing your head to the ground, is the same gesture that certain NPC characters perform during moments of deep submission or self-abasement. The player can learn this gesture and perform it at any time. The developers included a specific posture of maximum deference as a player action, which has resulted in community practices around using it in specific locations or situations. Easter egg 176. The gesture system in Elden Ring allows for a kind of communication that is outside the game's dialogue system. Players can gesture to each other during co-op play. Several gestures tell stories through their names alone. The gesture called Reverential Bow differs from the gesture called Gesture of Worship in ways that imply different traditions and different relationships to what is being deferred to. Easter egg 177. The whip weapons in the game have a unique property where they cannot deal critical hits. This is noted in their item description. The reason given in the lore is that the flexible nature of the weapon prevents it from delivering a precise enough strike for a critical blow. The developers built a mechanical limitation into a weapon type and then provided a lore justification that treats the game's damage system as a physical reality rather than an abstraction. Easter egg 178. The Rivers of Blood katana, which became one of the most used weapons in the game's online PvP ecosystem, has a description that refers to the blood of enemies flowing freely. Its skill produces an enormous amount of the blood flame status. The weapon's name is an obvious reference to its primary function. The developers named a weapon after what it does to other people, which is notably blunt for a game that usually describes weapons in terms of their history or origin. Easter egg 179. The Bloodhound's Fang, a curved greatsword associated with an NPC named Blade, who turns hostile later in his questline, has a skill that creates a rapid, evasive slash. The evasion in the skill mimics Blood's own movement patterns as an enemy. The developers built the NPC's combat identity into the weapon you receive from defeating him, so that using his weapon means enacting his style of movement. Easter egg 180. The Grafted Dragon, a fist weapon made from the arm Godric grafted onto himself, and that you remove in the boss fight, is one of the stranger weapons in the game. You fight using a severed dragon arm. The item description refers to it as still alive. It breathes fire. The developers built a living weapon out of the most grotesque detail of the game's first major boss fight. Easter egg 181. The Hoslow's Petal Whip, associated with the Volcano Manor questline, has an elegant name that contrasts sharply with what it is used for. The Hoslow family has a reputation for cruelty within the game's lore. The elegance of the name seems deliberate, suggesting a family that maintained an aesthetic of refinement while practicing violence. The developers used naming to do character work for a family that appears only in questlines and item descriptions. Easter egg 182. The Carian regal scepter, associated with Queen Renala's tradition, has a skill that fires enormous magic projectiles shaped like a full moon. Renala is associated with the moon. The Carian tradition is associated with the moon. The skill makes the weapon mechanically expressive of its thematic identity. The developers aligned the spell choice with the lore affiliation so completely that using the weapon feels like performing the identity of its tradition. Easter egg 183. Queen Renala of the Full Moon is one of the game's most discussed boss designs. Her first phase, in which students of the Academy protect her while she floats on a chandelier reading a book, is one of the most unusual in the game. She is not fighting you in this phase. She is being protected by others. The developers built a boss encounter where the actual boss is initially passive and defended, which creates a very different dynamic from most encounters. Easter egg 184. Renala's second phase is preceded by a cutscene where she holds a small golden egg and speaks to it as if to a child. The egg is described in lore as something she received from Radagon, her husband, who later became Marika. The developers built an entire tragic context into the cutscene so that players who understand the lore see Renala's madness, not as villainy, but as grief made permanent. Easter egg 185. Radagon and Marika are the same person. This is one of the game's most significant lore revelations, delivered in a cutscene late in the game. The discovery that the man who married Renala and the god who founded the current age are identical raises questions that the game does not fully answer. The developers built a metaphysical duality into the game's central divine figure, and then declined to explain it, leaving it as one of the most discussed mysteries in the community. Easter egg 186. The Radagon's Sourceal Talisman, associated with Radagon, provides both significant stat boosts and significant additional damage taken. It is a risk-reward item. The description refers to it as containing a scar or wound. The developers built the thematics of Radagon's fractured existence into a talisman's mechanical properties. The boost and the cost are a single object, inseparable. Easter egg 187. The Renala's full moon sorcery, obtained from her remembrance, is a massive ball of blue-white magical light. It reduces the magic resistance of anyone it hits. This mechanic is unusual for a single large projectile, but in the context of Renala's story, the full moon stripping away resistance suggests a force that removes the defenses people build between themselves and what they cannot face. The developers gave the sorcery a thematic reading alongside its mechanical one. Easter egg 188. There is an item in the game called Larval Tear that, when used at Renala's boss arena, allows the player to completely rebuild their character. The item is described as a larval stage, a beginning before a final form. The developers used biological metamorphosis language for character respec, framing what is a menu interface function as a transformation narrative. Visiting Renala to respec means returning to something unformed. Easter egg 189. The Pure Blood Knight's medal, used to teleport to Mogwyn Palace, is obtained from White-Faced Vare, an NPC who begins the game by insulting the player. His questline is unusual, in that following it aligns the player with a faction that is generally considered villainous. The medal represents acceptance into that faction. The developers built a questline where the reward is membership in something the game frames as wrong, and made it one of the more elaborately designed NPC stories in the game. Easter egg 190. Morg, Lord of Blood, is one of the more disturbing bosses in the game because of what his domain, the Mogwyn Palace, represents. The palace is beautiful, lit with golden blood, and haunted by the ghosts of Albinoric pilgrims who came there seeking something and never left. The developers built an aesthetic of beautiful horror into Mog's domain that is unlike anything else in the game. The gold and crimson colour palette makes violence look like ceremony. Easter egg 191. Mohg's second phase involves him anointing the player with blood using a ritual he calls a nihil. He says the word 3 times and does the ritual 3 times. The design of this moment, with its repetition and deliberate pacing, looks like a parody of a religious rite. The developers seem to have been thinking about how easily devotional structure can become menace when the object of devotion is wrong. Easter egg 192. The item associated with Miquella in Mohg's boss arena is a golden cocoon. The cocoon is Miquella's sleeping form. Mohg has been keeping it there throughout the game's timeline. The developers built an entire sub-tragedy into the Mohg boss fight by making Miquella's captivity the backdrop of the encounter. You are fighting in front of someone sleeping who may or may not be aware of what is happening around them. Easter egg 193. The Erdtree's Favour talisman, which boosts health, stamina, and equip load simultaneously, is one of the most sought-after items in the game. Its description refers to it as the token of the Erdtree's blessing, given to those who serve well. The fact that it is found in a dangerous location deep within the game world suggests that Erdtree's Favour is not freely given. You have to reach it. The developers aligned the item's mechanical value with the effort required to obtain it and framed both in lore terms. Easter egg 194. The item called Blessed Dew Talisman, which slowly regenerates health over time, has a description that attributes it to those who devoted their entire existence to quietly sustaining others. This frames passive health regeneration as an act of self-sacrifice. The developers wrote the game's most passive mechanical benefit as a story about devotion rather than a description of a magical process. Easter egg 195. The Dragon Crest Shield Talisman, which boosts physical defense, depicts a coiled dragon. This is unusual because the game's dragon mythology frames dragons as creatures associated with storm and sky rather than with earth and defense. A dragon curled into a shield shape is a dragon that has made itself into protection. The developers seem to have chosen an image that reframes the dragon not as a threat, but as a guardian. Easter egg 196. The Spelldrake Talisman, which boosts magic resistance, depicts a drake rather than a full dragon. In the game's mythology, drakes are younger and less developed than true dragons. The lower-tier talisman depicting a lesser creature is a small but consistent piece of internal logic. The developers maintain the game's draconic hierarchy even in the art on passive accessories. Easter egg 197. The Halig Drake Talisman boosts holy damage negation and depicts a dragon whose body shows signs of consecration, covered in golden markings. The developers built the game's cosmological faction alignment into the visual design of items associated with that faction. A dragon touched by the Erdtree's power looks different from an ordinary drake. The visual detail communicates the lore relationship without text. Easter egg 198. The Flame Drake Talisman depicts a dragon with fire in its body. The description refers to fire not as something the dragon breathes, but as something the dragon is. This framing of elemental identity rather than elemental ability suggests the developers were thinking about fire as a state of being for certain creatures, not just a weapon. Easter egg 199. The Immunizing Horn Charm, which boosts immunity to status effects, has a description that refers to horns as something that grows from enduring repeated harm. The implication is that the charm was made from material produced by a body that had been tested many times and had developed resistance through that testing. The developers built a theory of immunity through exposure into the item's origin story. Easter egg 200. The talisman pouch, which gives you additional talisman slots, has a description that is deliberately minimal. It simply says that it was made to carry more of what matters. This is the most functionally direct item description in the game, but the phrase "what matters" is notable. The developers could have said talismans or items. They chose "what matters," which is a value judgment embedded in a functional description. Easter egg 201. The remembrance of every major boss when held has a weight of 0. Remembrances are described as the condensed power of a defeated demigod or major figure. The developers made them weightless, which is an unusual choice in a game where item weight has mechanical significance. Weightlessness might suggest that the memory of a being has no physical substance, that what you carry is not an object, but an imprint. Easter egg 202. The Crimson Wall Bubble Tear, a crystal tear that converts health-damaging effects to healing effects under certain conditions, has a description that refers to it as formed from the tears of a warrior who wept for joy at the end of every battle. The developers built a personality into a consumable item ingredient. Someone cried tears of joy consistently enough that those tears crystallized into something useful. The developers made relief into a physical resource. Easter egg 203. The opaline hard tear, which temporarily maximizes all damage negation, when consumed, is described as formed from a tear wept by one who endured tremendous pain with great stoicism. The developers connected the item's mechanical function of maximum defense to an emotional register of endurance. The strongest possible protection comes from those who bear the most without breaking. Easter egg 204. The ruptured crystal tear, which causes a massive explosion after a delay, is described as formed from tears wept in rage. The developers connected explosion to anger in a way that treats anger as a physical force with real consequences. The tear does not just add fire damage, it detonates. The emotional register of the origin story matches the mechanical behavior of the item. Easter egg 205. The cerulean hidden tear, which removes FP costs for a period, is described as formed from a tear wept by a sorcerer who reached the absolute limit of their power and then found more. This is a description of a second wind. The developers wrote a story about exceeding limits and turned it into an item that mechanically removes cost. The tear gives you a period where magic is free because someone once found a way past their limit. Easter egg 206. The Crimson Amber Medallion, one of the earliest talismans most players find, which simply increases maximum health, has a description that attributes it to someone who placed enormous value on continued existence. This is a straightforward characterization of someone who wanted to survive more than anything. The developers wrote the simplest possible character motivation into the description of the most mechanically simple talisman in the game. Easter egg 207. The Ritual Shield. Talisman, which raises damage negation when health is full, has a description that attributes it to a duel tradition where the combatants pledge to fight at their best. The implication is that fighting at full health is a form of respect for the opponent. The developers connected a defensive mechanic to an ethical framework about the conditions under which combat is honorable. Easter egg 208. The Ritual Sword. Talisman, which raises attack power when health is full, is paired with the Ritual Shield talisman as a matched set. Together, they suggest a dual tradition in which both offense and defense are sharpened by the condition of not being wounded. The developers designed two items that are individually interesting but gain additional meaning when understood as parts of a tradition. Easter egg 209. The Dagger Talisman, which increases critical hit damage, depicts a dagger on its face in a straightforward way, but the description refers to the dagger as a weapon for those who strike where others hesitate. This is a description of aggression and decisiveness turned into a character trait. The developers characterized a critical hit bonus as a personality rather than just a damage multiplier. Easter egg 210. The Millicent questline is one of the most elaborately constructed optional storylines in the game. Millicent is a young woman infected with scarlet rot who is slowly losing herself to the disease. Her story parallels Melania's, and she may be one of Melania's daughters, created by Michaela's attempt to find a cure. Her questline ends in one of two ways depending on player choice. The developers built a moral decision into the conclusion of a questline that is easy to miss entirely. Easter egg 211. The unalloyed gold needle, central to Millicent's story, is a tool created by Michaela to combat the scarlet rot. The needle's description refers to it as something that holds back a tide rather than stopping it. This specific metaphor, the tide rather than a wall or a cure, suggests the rot is always present and always pressing, and that the needle only delays rather than resolves. The developers built a tragic prognosis into the item's description. Easter egg 212. When Millicent dies at the end of her questline, regardless of which path is chosen, the needle she carried can be retrieved. Returning it to the place where Malenia is fought, after Malenia is defeated, triggers an event. The developers built a post-boss interaction that most players never find because it requires carrying a specific item to a boss arena after the boss is dead and doing something there. Easter egg 213. The dragon scale blade, obtained from a specific enemy type in the Lake of Rot area beneath Ansel River, has a skill that creates a trail of ice crystals. The weapon is made from dragon scales, which are typically associated with fire or lightning. A dragon scale weapon that creates ice is unusual. The developers seem to have been pointing toward a specific subset of dragon lore that acknowledges cold-natured dragons, which are rarer in the game but are referenced in a few item descriptions. Easter egg 214. The Lake of Rot, the underground sea of scarlet rot found beneath Ansel River, is one of the most hostile traversal environments in the game. Simply standing in it damages you continuously. The developers placed a large navigational puzzle, finding raised platforms to stand on while crossing, in an area that punishes stopping to look around. The tension between needing to move carefully and being punished for moving slowly is a deliberate design choice. Easter egg 215. Ainsel River, the underground region above the Lake of Rot, contains a miniature figure of Rani. If you speak to this figure, she is inside it, having made herself small and placed herself in a safe container while you adventure on her behalf. The visual of the figure is unsettling in a quiet way. Rani is powerful and confident in all her other appearances. Here she is small and hidden. The developers included a visual of vulnerability in the characterization of one of the game's most composed figures. Easter egg 216. The Astel enemies, which appear in several locations as bosses, are described as creatures that fall from the sky. They are referred to as natural, born of the void. Their design is alien in the truest sense of the word. They have insect-like bodies, but their faces are closer to human. The developers built an encounter with something genuinely other than the game's existing mythological vocabulary. The Astel are not connected to any established faction or tradition. They simply fall. Easter egg 217. Astel, natural born of the void, the boss found at the end of Ainsel River, is preceded by a very long tunnel approach. The tunnel is quiet. There are very few enemies. It is one of the longest uninterrupted walks in the game before a boss. The developers seem to have used the length and quietness of the approach to create a sense of deep isolation before encountering something that comes from outside the world entirely. Easter egg 218. The meteorite of Astel sorcery, cast using the staff associated with the meteorite region, fires a barrage of smaller projectiles in a widespread pattern. The description refers to a meteorite that carries fragments of the void with it. This frames the spell not as a recreation of falling rocks, but as a method of bringing pieces of outer space into the fight. The developers built cosmological scale into a mid-level offensive sorcery. Easter egg 219. The rock-sling sorcery, found near a meteorite site in Caelid, hurls pieces of the ground at the target. Its description refers to the sorcerer using gravitational forces to tear the world apart in small pieces and throw those pieces. This is a description of weaponized physics. The developers wrote a sorcery description that treats gravity not as a magical force, but as a property of the physical world being repurposed. Easter egg 220. The gravity well sorcery creates a sphere that pulls enemies toward it. Its description mentions that it was developed by studying the behavior of celestial bodies and how they exert influence on each other. This frames the sorcery as a product of scientific observation. The glintstone tradition in the game is presented as a form of magical science, and the developers reinforce this by writing descriptions that treat magical development as an empirical process. Easter egg 221. The Terra Magica sorcery, which creates a circle of magical energy that boosts sorcery damage for anyone standing inside it, is described as something that draws the power of a magical ley line to the surface. This concept of magical lines running through the ground has parallels in several real-world traditions. The developers seem to have drawn on the idea of ley lines to give their boosting sorcery a cosmological basis rather than just a mechanical function. Easter egg 222. The magic glint blade sorcery, which delays a blade that appears and strikes after a pause, has a description that refers to delayed justice. This is a philosophical framing of a timing mechanic. The developers chose to write about delayed action in ethical terms, as if the blade's pause before striking is a period of consideration before consequence. It is one of the more unusual conceptual framings of a combat ability in the game. Easter egg 223. The Karian Greatsword sorcery conjures a massive magical blade for a single downward strike. Its description refers to it as a spell developed for use against armored opponents in close quarters. This is a practical military context for a sorcery, unusual in a tradition generally associated with long-range magical research. The developers built a military application into an academic magic tradition, suggesting Karian sorcerers were also soldiers. Easter egg 224. The Founding Rain of Stars sorcery, which calls down a shower of magical projectiles from above, is described as a recreation of the primordial rain of light that fell before the current age began. The developers built creation mythology into a combat sorcery by framing it as a reenactment of a cosmic event. Casting this spell means performing, in miniature, something that once shaped the world. Easter egg 225. The Loretta's Mastery sorcery, obtained from Loretta's Remembrance, is the most powerful version of a ranged magical arrow attack. Its description calls it the culmination of a lifetime of practice. The developers frame the strongest version of Loretta's ability not as something she was born with, but as something she built through sustained effort. This characterization of mastery as accumulated practice is embedded in an endgame sorcery description. Easter egg 226. Theodorix's Magma, an incantation obtained from a dragon boss, hurls a ball of magma that flows along the ground. The dragon it comes from, Theodorix, is one of the named dragons in the game. The developers gave this spell the name of the specific dragon it came from rather than a generic descriptor, maintaining the game's principle that specific creatures have specific histories rather than existing as nameless sources of generic resources. Easter egg 227. The Borealis's Mist incantation, obtained from a dragon called Borealis the Freezing Fog, creates a cloud of freezing breath. The name Borealis is a reference to the Aurora Borealis, the northern lights, which are associated with cold and with light in the sky. The developers named a frost-breathing dragon after a real atmospheric phenomenon associated with cold, connecting the game's draconic mythology to real-world natural phenomena. Easter egg 228. Glintstone Ice Crag, a sorcery that fires a bolt of magical frost, has a description that refers to it as one of the first sorceries a student at Raya Lucaria would learn. This establishes a curriculum hierarchy. The developers built an implied academic structure into their magic system by noting which spells belonged to introductory study and which represent advanced specialization. The game has an invisible school of magic with an invisible syllabus. Easter egg 229. The rune arc item, which activates the effect of the great rune equipped by the player, is described as made from the fragments of the broken Elden Ring. This is a remarkable claim. Every time a player uses a rune arc to empower themselves, they are using a piece of the shattered cosmic law that the entire game is about repairing. The developers made the most commonly used buff item in the game a direct material consequence of the game's central catastrophe. Easter egg 230. The golden rune items, used as currency or to level up, are described as condensed grace that leaked from the Erd tree during the shattering. This frames money in the game as spiritual residue from the event that broke the world. Every time a player sells a golden rune or uses it to level up, they are converting cosmic fallout into personal advancement. The developers made the economy of the game inseparable from its theology. Easter egg 231. The smithing stone system for upgrading weapons is tiered from 1 to 9, with somber smithing stones used for special weapons. The highest tier stones, ancient and somber ancient, are rare and guarded. The naming convention of the stones, from plain to somber to ancient, suggests a history of smithing practice and the gradual discovery of harder and stranger materials. The developers gave the crafting material hierarchy a sense of geological and historical time. Easter egg 232. The bell bearings mechanic, where you offer the bell bearings of defeated merchants or found items to twin maiden husks at the round table hold in exchange for unlimited access to those merchants' inventories, is described in lore as the practice of absorbing the knowledge of the dead. The twin maiden husks absorb the bell bearing and gain the merchant's catalogue. The developers built knowledge transfer through death into what is primarily a convenience mechanic. Easter egg 233. The twin maiden husks themselves are described as the conjoined remains of two maidens whose bells were merged into one. Their existence is unusual even by the standards of the game. They do not speak about their own nature, they simply function. The developers gave one of the most frequently visited NPCs in the game a genuinely strange lore context that most players never investigate. Easter egg 234. The Church of Ella, the first merchant location most players find, contains a merchant named Kale who sells basic supplies. Kale's dialogue is warm and practical. He mentions that he has travelled for a long time. His item descriptions have nothing unusual in them. But if you visit the Church of Ella after a certain point in the game, Kale is gone. No explanation is given. He is simply no longer there. The developers built a quiet disappearance into one of the first friendly characters the player meets. Easter egg 235. The isolated merchant found in Weeping Peninsula has a name that describes his situation with complete accuracy. He is isolated. His dialogue reflects this. He talks about the difficulty of maintaining a shop when no one comes. He is honest about his circumstances in a way that most NPCs in the game are not. The developers wrote a character defined by candor about loneliness and placed him somewhere that reinforces that loneliness. Easter egg 236. The nomadic merchant characters found throughout the lands between are described as part of a travelling merchant tradition. Their camps are consistent in design, a cart, a fire, certain categories of goods. The visual consistency suggests a merchant culture with shared practices. The developers built an invisible social organisation into a series of scattered NPCs by giving them matching aesthetics and overlapping dialogue themes. Easter egg 237. The item called Stone Sword Key, used to break magical seals called imp statues, is described as made to unlock those specific seals in response to a specific tradition of protective enchantment. There are a limited number of Stone Sword keys in the game and a limited number of imp statue seals. The developers balanced the supply of keys and the number of seals deliberately, creating a resource management layer around the decision of which secrets to pursue. Easter egg 238. The imp statues themselves, which break apart when a stone sword key is used on them, are designed to look uncomfortable. They have strained poses, arms extended, faces contorted. The developers seem to have designed the sealing mechanism to look like something bound rather than something at rest. An imp frozen in an uncomfortable position suggests the statue was placed there under conditions that were not pleasant for the imp. Easter egg 239. There is a location in Kylid called the Abandoned Cave that contains a group of Miranda flowers, plant enemies that emit poison and sleep gases. Miranda flowers look like they should be beautiful. Their visual design is floral and elaborate. The juxtaposition of beautiful form and lethal function seems deliberate, suggesting the developers were thinking about the relationship between attractive appearance and danger in the game's ecosystem. Easter egg 240. The Miranda flower enemies, when defeated, drop Miranda powder, which is used in crafting. This creates a material loop where a dangerous creature becomes a crafting resource that is used to make items related to the same properties the creature used against you. The developers built a consistent internal logic where you learn to work with what the world offers, even when what it offers is hostile. Easter egg 241. The Swamp of Aeonia, the most contaminated area of Kylid, is where Malenia's scarlet rot bloom occurred. Standing in the swamp deals constant scarlet rot build-up. The developers placed the most toxic environment in the game at the site of the event that caused the rot. The geography of the swamp is a record of where Malenia landed. The landscape is a historical document. Easter egg 242. The Commander O'Neill boss, found in the centre of the Swamp of Aeonia, is a military commander who refused to retreat when the rot came and has since been transformed by it. His weapon is still a military standard, a banner mounted on a spear. His design suggests a soldier who held his ground long past the point where holding ground made sense, now trapped in a moment of defiance that has become its own kind of madness. The developers built a military tragedy into a mid-game boss. Easter egg 243. The Aeonian butterfly, a crafting material found in Kylid, has a description that refers to butterflies that thrived after the scarlet rot bloom as creatures adapted to an extreme environment. Rather than dying, they evolved. The developers built resilience into the ecology of a destroyed region. Life finds a way is a well-worn phrase, but the developers made it specific by describing exactly how a particular creature adapted to a particular catastrophe. Easter egg 244. The rot butterfly, similar to the Aeonian butterfly, but more deeply affected by the rot, is described as carrying the scarlet rot in its wings. The insects of Kylid are a taxonomy of degrees of adaptation. The developers seem to have been thinking carefully about how a single environmental catastrophe produces a range of ecological responses, from full adaptation to partial infection to death, and then built that range into their crafting material categories. Easter egg 245. The item called immunizing cured meat, which provides immunity to a specific status effect for a period, is described as a technique developed by those who regularly traveled through hostile environments as a way of preparing themselves before entering danger. The developers built a culture of preparation into their consumable system, framing the act of buffing before a dangerous area as a practice with a history. Easter egg 246. The soft cotton item, which reduces fall damage when used, is described as something woven from a plant that grows in very high places and developed its softness as a way of letting seeds drift long distances. The developers built an evolutionary backstory into a fall damage mitigation consumable, which is an unusual amount of ecological thought for an item with a fairly narrow mechanical function. Easter egg 247. Rotten stray ashes which summon a rot-infused dog have a description that refers to the animal as one that wandered into the rot region and was changed by it. The spirit ash describes a specific trajectory, a dog that was once normal and went somewhere that transformed it. This is not described as suffering. The description is neutral. The developers seem to have been presenting the rot not as purely evil, but as a transformative force whose morality depends on your prior assumptions. Easter egg 248. The kindred of rot enemies, half-human, half-insect creatures found in rot-infused areas, have armor descriptions that suggest they were once ordinary humans who consumed enough scarlet rot to begin transforming. The transformation is described as voluntary in some cases. Some of the kindred chose this. The developers built agency into a process that looks from the outside like victimization. Easter egg 249. Clean rot night enemies, who serve millennia, are described as knights who willingly expose themselves to the scarlet rot as a form of devotion. They are carriers who did not fully transform. Their armor is described as smelling faintly of rot beneath the metal. The developers built olfactory detail into the lore of an enemy type. The clean rot knights carry the rot as a mark of loyalty, and the game communicates this partly through smell. Easter egg 250. The quarry area in Liurnia, accessible only by traversing a path that many players miss, contains a mine where glintstone is extracted. The workers are still there, or what is left of them. Some have been transformed by exposure to glintstone into something not quite human. The developers built a labor hazard into the backstory of the game's primary magical material. Mining glintstone is dangerous, and the mine shows you what happens to those who are exposed too long. Easter egg 251. The Scholar's Armament spell, which adds magical damage to right-hand weapons, has a description that refers to a scholarly tradition of enhancing weapons rather than the body. This contrasts with the physical enhancement spells available in other traditions. The developers seem to have been thinking about how the glintstone scholars would have approached combat enhancement, through tools rather than through self-modification. Easter egg 252. The Starlight Shards, items that restore FP, are described as fragments of a meteor that carries a faint residual glow from passing through the void. The developers connected the act of consuming magical energy to a cosmological event. Restoring your magic means consuming starlight. The most routine mechanical action of FP recovery is described in terms of the cosmos. Easter egg 253. There is a specific location in Liurnia where if you stand at a certain viewpoint and look toward the Erd tree on a clear in-game day, the position and angle are precisely what they would need to be for the Erd tree to appear to be rising directly from the center of the distant city. The developers seem to have set up this view deliberately, framing the Erd tree as a piece of intentional architecture in the landscape as much as a living cosmic entity. Easter egg 254. The Stormhawk King item, given to Nephili Lu as part of a questline that is easy to fail, unlocks a specific ending for her story. Without it, her storyline ends in stasis. With it, her ending becomes active and resolved. The developers built a single item as the pivot point of an entire NPC's narrative trajectory. Miss the item, and her story stays incomplete. Find it and give it to her, and she has a future. Easter egg 255. The Stormhawk King item is found on a body in the Chapel of Anticipation, the starting area of the game. The Chapel of Anticipation is only revisited once, in a late-game teleport. Most players who return there are focused on a boss encounter and do not explore the area again. The item that resolves Nephili's questline is sitting in the place most players think they are done with. The developers hid a questline resolution in the area the game begins. Easter egg 256. The Snow Witch hat associated with Ranni's questline was worn by Ranni's teacher when she was learning sorcery. Ranni still wears a version of it on her doll form. This detail connecting the hat worn by the figure in her memory. to the hat on her current body is a small piece of characterization. Rani carries a physical reminder of her teacher as part of her appearance. The developers built sentimentality into a character costume. Easter egg 257. The Electo, Black Knife ringleader boss, drops the Black Knife armor set. Wearing this set makes your movement quieter in a way that has mechanical effects. The developers built the stealth property of the assassin's armor into a passive mechanical benefit for the player. Wearing the armor of the people who killed a god gives you some of the quality that made them capable of doing it. Easter egg 258. The item called Michaela's Lily is named for Michaela's favourite flower. It is used in several important crafting recipes. The fact that a specific demigod's preferred flower exists as a craftable material in the game suggests the developers were building Michaela's preferences into the game's ecology. His favourite flower grows in the world. It can be gathered. The game has a botany shaped partially by divine preference. Easter egg 259. The warming stone, a craftable item that creates a warm area that slowly heals allies, has a description that refers to it as something shared between warriors to help each other rest. This is a description of solidarity as a craft skill. The developers wrote the act of caring for your companions into a crafting system, suggesting that making a warming stone is a form of expressing concern for other people. Easter egg 260. The freezing grease item, which adds frost damage to weapons, is described as made from the crystallized moisture of a high-altitude environment. The developers built a geography of cold into the crafting material's origin. The grease comes from somewhere cold. You use it to bring that cold somewhere else. The game's crafting system has an implicit ecology where materials carry the character of where they came from. Easter egg 261. The soporific grease mentioned earlier is paired in the crafting system with items that resist sleep. The existence of both sleep-inducing and sleep-resisting craftable items suggests the developers were thinking about sleep as a contested battlefield condition, something that both sides of an encounter might be trying to control. The game has an invisible, strategic dimension around status conditions that the crafting system reflects. Easter egg 262. The fated pot, which creates a cloud of poison and rot, is described as extremely unpleasant to make. The crafting description notes the smell. This is one of very few items whose description acknowledges the sensory experience of the crafting process rather than just the result. The developers chose to humanize the act of making this particular item by noting that the person who made it suffered for it. Easter egg 263. The perfume bottle mechanic, where you craft combat perfumes with various effects, has a description that refers to perfumers as those who weaponized beauty. This is a remarkable framing. The perfumes look and smell pleasant. They do terrible things to enemies. The developers built an aesthetic identity for a weapon category that presents destruction in the language of refinement. Easter egg 264. The Frenzy Flame Stone, a crafting material associated with the frenzied flame, is described as a chunk of material that feels warm to the touch and agitated in the hand. The sensory description of an item that resists being held quietly suggests the frenzied flame is not a passive substance, but something actively uncomfortable to carry. The developers built restlessness into the physical texture of a crafting material. Easter egg 265. The Spirit Gale item, used to upgrade spirit summons, is described as the concentrated life force of a spirit that has been bound in a specific way. This implies a process, someone binding spirit life force and concentrating it. That is never explained. The game has an entire infrastructure of spirit work visible only in the descriptions of items used to interact with that infrastructure. Easter egg 266. Roderica, the NPC who becomes the spirit tuner and allows you to upgrade your spirit ashes, began as someone who came to the lands between as part of someone else's expedition. Her original group did not survive. She stayed. Her willingness to remain in a place that destroyed everyone she came with, and then to find a purpose. There is one of the quieter stories of adaptation and resilience in the game. Easter egg 267. Roderica's starting dialogue, before her questline is advanced, contains lines about feeling something calling to her from the spirits of those who died. This is not dramatic. She describes it as an itch or a sense rather than a vision. The developers wrote her nascent magical ability as something quiet and unsettling rather than as a grand power manifesting. It feels like the beginning of something she does not understand yet. Easter egg 268. Hugh, the blacksmith found at the Round Table Hold, is under a curse that prevents him from leaving. He knows this. He accepts it. His dialogue across the course of the game shifts in subtle ways as events unfold around him. By the late game, he speaks differently than he did at the beginning. The developers built an internal arc for a character who never moves from his forge, tracking it through dialogue alone. Easter egg 269. Hugh mentions that he has a dream of forging a weapon that could kill a god. He never accomplishes this dream. He will keep trying. This is one of the more plainly stated ambitions in the game, and one of the more clearly impossible ones given his circumstances. The developers wrote a character defined by an aspiration that the player never sees fulfilled, which gives their interactions with him a specific emotional weight. Easter egg 270. The Round Table. Hold itself exists in a space between worlds. This is stated in its description and implied by the way it is accessed via the map, which shows no physical location for it. The developers built the hub area of the game into a pocket dimension, which is unusual for a game that otherwise has a very concrete and navigable physical world. The Hold exists outside the lands between's geography. Easter egg 271. There is a locked door in the Round Table Hold that can be opened eventually with a specific key. Behind it is a room with a chest. The chest contains an important item. Most players find this door early and try to force it or find a way around it. The key that opens it is not found near the door. The developers placed an obstacle and its solution in entirely different parts of the game, trusting players to remember the locked door when they eventually find the key. Easter egg 272. The two fingers in the Round Table Hold are draped with a cloth and attended by finger reader Enia. Their slow, laboured movements and their breathless vocalizations are significantly more distressed than the two fingers found in other locations. This suggests that the two fingers in the Round Table Hold are in poor health, which is consistent with their connection to the broken Elden Ring. The developers built physical deterioration into the divine intermediaries at the centre of the game's hub. Easter egg 273. The War Surgeon armour set, associated with Mog's narrative, has a description that refers to its wearer as someone who attended to wounded warriors while also practicing blood magic. This describes a specific medieval tradition of surgeons who are also practitioners of less reputable arts. The developers seem to have drawn on the history of medical magical hybrids to build the War Surgeon's professional identity. Easter egg 274. The nomadic warrior's cookbook items are found throughout the game in locations consistent with nomadic travel routes. They appear on ridgelines, at fords, on paths between regions. The placement of these cookbooks along routes that a travelling person would actually take is a form of environmental storytelling that most players experience unconsciously. Feeling the world is plausible without identifying why. Easter egg 275. The Arteria leaf, a crafting material that speeds up item usage, has a description that refers to it as a leaf shaped like a blood vessel, named for its resemblance to the body's pathways. The developers connected a speed of action improvement to a metaphor of internal channels that allow things to flow quickly. The item's name and its mechanical function are aligned through the metaphor of circulation. Easter egg 276. The budding horn item used in crafting is described as a horn found on creatures that are in a transitional state. This is a specific life stage reference. The developers built developmental biology into their crafting system. The horn is valuable because of what stage of growth it represents, not just because it is a horn. Easter egg 277. The sacramental bud, a plant used in crafting holy items, grows near sites of religious significance. Players who notice where these buds appear and where they do not can map the game's sacred geography through the distribution of a crafting material. The developers built religious cartography into the ecology of a plant. Easter egg 278. The fan daggers, a throwable weapon that fires 3 blades simultaneously, is described as a carnival trick converted into a combat technique. This is one of the few items in the game described as originating in entertainment rather than warfare or magic. The developers seem to have been thinking about the ways that performance and combat borrow techniques from each other. Easter egg 279. The ghost glovewort flowers used to upgrade spirit summons are described as blooming only in the presence of death. They grow in catacombs and ruins and dungeons. The developers built a funerary ecology into their spirit upgrade system, making the most important resource for strengthening your spiritual allies something that grows where people have died. Easter egg 280. The grave violet flowers, also found in areas associated with death, are described as growing from the buried dead. This is a real-world phenomenon referenced in botanical history, where flowers and plants grow over burial sites partly because of the nutrients from decomposition. The developers built actual ecological science into the game's funerary botany. Easter egg 281. The Death's poker weapon, a skeleton staff, is described as used by those in the service of Godwin's death phenomenon. Its skill involves a delayed explosion of death fire, a specific type of fire associated with Godwin's deathroot corruption. The developers connected the gameplay mechanics of a specific weapon to the lore mechanics of a specific narrative event, so that the weapon's behavior makes sense within the story, rather than just within the game system. Easter egg 282. The deathbird enemies which appear at night near churches and sites of grace are described as the birds that come before death, not after. In many traditions, birds are associated with the soul's departure after death. These birds precede the event. The developers inverted the traditional symbolic relationship, making the deathbirds heralds rather than collectors. Easter egg 283. There are ruins scattered throughout the lands between that contain items, but no enemies. These empty ruins are among the more thoughtful details in the game's environmental design. They suggest that not every historical location was a fortress or a battlefield. Some were just homes or workshops that have since been abandoned. The presence of items without guardians implies ordinary life rather than adventure. Easter egg 284. The Warhawk enemies, large aggressive birds found in Stormvale Castle and elsewhere, are described as trained warbirds. Their nesting sites within the castle suggest they have been living there for an extended period, long enough to establish territory. The developers built an ecological plausibility into an enemy type by giving them behavior consistent with actual bird territorial patterns. Easter egg 285. The bird's eye telescope item, which lets you zoom in on distant areas, is described as crafted by a merchant who spent his life trying to see things that were too far away to reach. This small backstory for a utility item suggests a character defined by longing for distance. He built a way to see faraway things because he could not go to them. The developers turned a crafting tool into a piece of melancholy biography. Easter egg 286. The scarab enemies, which appear as scarab beetles rolling dung balls of runes across the landscape, are described in lore as sacred dung beetles that collect lost grace. This is a direct reference to the Egyptian sacred scarab tradition, in which the dung beetle rolling a ball of dung was associated with the sun, God rolling the sun across the sky. The developers borrowed this mythological framework and applied it to the game's currency and divine power system. Easter egg 287. The Rejuvius, a dagger associated with an NPC called Magnus the Beast Claw, is described as made from the claw of a specific beast. The developers named the beast and described the claw, connecting a weapon's material origin to a specific creature rather than to a general material category. This is consistent across many weapons in the game, but the specificity of Magnus's dagger makes it a notable example. Easter egg 288. The Elden Star's incantation, associated with the Greater Will, calls down a stream of golden stars from above. Its description refers to this as the primordial incantation, the oldest of all spells, one that preceded the current age. The developers built a chronological hierarchy into their magic system by identifying a specific spell as the oldest in existence. Using it means casting something that predates the game's entire setting. Easter egg 289. The black flame incantations associated with the Godskin Apostles are described as a form of fire that burns not the body, but the divinity within the body. This is a metaphysical distinction between two types of fire that plays out mechanically. Black flame deals a percentage of the enemy's total health as damage. Against bosses with high health pools, this is significant. The developers built a mechanical expression of a metaphysical distinction. Easter egg 290. The blood boon incantation, which covers the ground in a spreading pool of blood flame, is described as a blessing that Morg bestowed on those who followed him. The term blessing in a game full of divine blessing language is being used to describe what is essentially a curse. The developers built an ironic use of benediction language into the description of a destructive ability, which is consistent with how Mog's entire domain presents itself. Easter egg 291. The bestial incantations associated with Gurank the Beast Clergyman are described as prayers in the form of howls and roars rather than spoken language. This is an unusual description of a prayer tradition. The developers built an animalistic theology into the Beast Clergyman tradition, where the language of worship is not words but sounds, and where those sounds are described as prayers rather than just attacks. Easter egg 292. The Flame of the Fell God, an incantation that drops a massive ball of fire, is described as the power wielded by the fire giants before Godfrey's campaign destroyed most of them. Using this incantation means using the power of a civilization that was nearly exterminated. The developers built historical guilt into a combat ability by framing it as borrowed from the defeated. Easter egg 293. The Honed Bolt incantation, which fires a spear of lightning, is described as the simplest application of the storm's power. The word simplest here is relative, since it is still a spear of lightning thrown by a person. The developers built a sense of scale into their lightning tradition by describing their most basic ability in terms of its position within a larger framework of escalating power. Easter egg 294. The Law of Causality incantation, which stores energy and releases it after you take enough hits, is described as a law of the universe rather than a spell. The developers framed this ability as something that exists independently of the caster, a property of reality that the incantation invokes rather than creates. This distinction between magic that makes something happen and magic that taps into something already true is consistent with how the game's theology treats different power sources. Easter egg 295. The Radagon's Rings of Light incantation, which fires golden rings in a pattern, was associated with Radagon's own combat style. The item's description notes that Radagon developed it to supplement his martial abilities with ranged holy power. This connects an accessible mid-game incantation to the personal history of a major figure. You are casting something Radagon invented. The developers built divine authorship into a craftable magical ability. Easter egg 296. There is a minor detail in the round table hold that many players never notice. The chandelier above the main room can be destroyed. If you deal enough damage to it, it falls. This has no practical effect on the game and serves no purpose in any questline. But the developers made the chandelier destructible. It is a small piece of physical simulation placed in a hub area where destruction has no stakes. Easter egg 297. The comet sorcery, which fires a large magical projectile at high speed, has a description that says the projectile bends space as it travels, arriving faster than the eye can track. This is a reference to the physics of objects traveling near the speed of light in real-world physics, where space-time distortion becomes relevant. The developers built relativistic physics into the description of a magic missile. Easter egg 298. Glintstone Pebble, the most basic offensive sorcery and the one most players learn first, has a description that calls it the simplest expression of Glintstone's properties. The Glintstone Pebble is described elsewhere as a fragment of a star that fell to Earth. So the most basic magic ability in the game involves throwing a piece of star. The developers built Cosmic Scale into the first offensive spell most players cast. Easter egg 299. The Crystal Torrent sorcery, which fires a barrage of magical crystals at high speed, is described as consuming the sorcerer's FP at a rate that approaches recklessness. The description uses a risk word to characterize what is otherwise just a rapid-fire spell. The developers built a sense of danger into the casting process itself, framing the most powerful sustained sorceries as things that could exhaust the caster dangerously. Easter egg 300. The Magma Shot sorcery, found in a volcanic region, fires a ball of lava that bounces. The bouncing physics of the lava ball is unusual for a sorcery projectile and seems to have been developed by a tradition that observed how actual lava moves when launched as a projectile rather than flowing along surfaces. The developers built empirical observation into the design of a combat spell by making the spell behave consistently with the physical properties of its material. Easter egg 301. The Altus Bloom crafting item found in Altus Plateau is described as a flower that only blooms at altitude. The developers built an ecological detail into a crafting material that makes geographic sense. If you gather these flowers, they only appear in a specific region, which reinforces the idea that the game's ecology is consistent rather than arbitrarily placing materials wherever players need them. Easter egg 302. The Stormvale cliffside site of grace is positioned at a specific height on the cliff face. From this spot in clear weather, you can see all the way to the Erd Tree on the horizon. The developers placed a rest point with a view that communicates how far the player has come and how much further there is to go. The vista from a site of grace functions as both a reward and a reminder. Easter egg 303. The item description of the fur-calling finger remedy contains a specific phrase about the act of asking for help, being its own kind of courage. This is not a game design statement, it is a character statement embedded in a mechanics-enabling item. The developers chose to put an encouragement in the item that enables summoning allies, framing asking for help as something the game values rather than something it merely accommodates. Easter egg 304. The multiplayer competitive summons, called the Festering Bloody Finger and the Bloody Finger, allow players to invade other worlds. But there is also a non-hostile version of multiplayer interaction called the Blue Cipher Ring, which summons you into other worlds to defend them. The developers built both aggression and defense into their competitive multiplayer system, with items named to reflect each orientation. The Blue Cipher Ring is named for protection. The Bloody Finger is named for violence, Easter egg 305. There is a hidden room in Stormvale Castle accessible through a specific path that most players miss. The room contains a sleeping giant. He does not wake up unless attacked. His item drop is not particularly remarkable. But the developers placed a sleeping giant in a hidden room for players to find, which rewards exploration with something that is less about practical gain and more about the experience of finding something genuinely surprising. Easter egg 306. The Moonveil skill, Transient Moonlight, produces a horizontal and vertical wave of light that deals both physical and magical damage. The split between physical and magical damage in this skill is mechanically unusual. The developers built a dual nature weapon skill into one of the most used katanas in the game. The moon, as the game frames it, is associated with both the material and the mystical. The skill's dual damage types express this. Easter egg 307. The Coded Sword, a weapon associated with the Erdtree's divine law, deals holy damage only and cannot deal any other type. This mechanical exclusivity reflects its identity as a weapon of pure divine authority. It does not mix, it does not hedge, it is entirely what it is. The developers built doctrinal purity into the mechanical properties of a specific weapon type, which is a very specific form of game design, as lore expression. Easter egg 308. The Sacred Relic Sword, obtained from the Elden Beast's remembrance, produces a massive golden wave when its skill is used. The visual of the wave fills the entire arena it is used in. The developers gave the weapon associated with the game's final boss a skill whose visual scale matches the scale of what the Elden Beast represents. Using the weapon feels like enacting the power of the cosmic law rather than just wielding a big sword. Easter egg 309. The Bolt of Gransax, an enormous spear embedded in the royal capital, can be obtained as a weapon. It is described as a weapon that was used against Gransax the dragon during a siege of the capital. The spear in the capital is the actual weapon from that event, still embedded where it landed. The developers placed historical evidence of a specific event in the environment and then let players pull it out and use it, connecting the weapon's origin to its current utility. Easter egg 310. The Dragon King's Cragblade, associated with the ancient dragon tradition, and specifically with Dragon Lord Placidusax, is described as a blade made from the condensed power of lightning that predates the current age. This connects the weapon to the forgotten god Placidusax served. Using it means using power from before the game's entire established history. The developers built temporal scale into a craftable weapon by framing its material as prehistoric. Easter egg 311. There are messages in the game that the developers left for players using the same message system players use to communicate. These messages, written by the developers under in-game names, are scattered throughout the world. One of them, found near a high ledge, simply says, "Jump. There is a treasure below." The developers wrote into their own game as if they were players, using the communal message system to communicate directly with the community in the same format the community uses. Easter egg 312. The item called Newman's Rune, a large rune worth significant runes when used, is described as belonging to those who came from beyond the lands between. The word Newman is a Latin word referring to a divine will or power. The developers named a high-value rune for a concept of divine authority, suggesting that those who came from outside the game's world carried with them a power that can be directly converted into growth. Easter egg 313. The Erdtree's Favour, +2, the highest tier of this talisman, is one of the rarest items in the game, and is only found in the endgame area of Farum Azula. Its description is identical to the base version, except for a single word that indicates increased blessing. The developers made the most powerful version of the most sought-after talisman, identical in lore to its lesser versions, suggesting that the difference between a small blessing and a great one is a matter of degree rather than kind. Easter egg 314. The item called Star Scourge Heirloom, associated with Radan, provides a boost to the strength attribute. Radan was the student of a lion, and his devotion to strength as a virtue is one of his defining characteristics. The developers built his philosophical commitment to strength into a passive attribute bonus given by his heirloom, so that carrying his memory means becoming a little stronger. Easter egg 315. The primal glintstone blade talisman, which reduces spell cost at the expense of maximum health, is described as made from a stone that was once embedded in a sorcerer's skull. This is a disturbing origin. The sorcerer embedded a stone in their own head to improve their spellcasting. The talisman represents the removed version of that embedded stone, which means someone took it out of a skull to make it wearable. The developers built body horror into a passive damage reduction item. Easter egg 316. The Godskin Swaddling Cloth Talisman, associated with the Godskin tradition, regenerates health after successive attacks. Its description refers to swaddling cloth as something used to bind infants, and the implication is that this cloth was used to bind gods. The visual of infant clothing used to restrain divine beings is one of the more disturbing images in the game's item vocabulary. Easter egg 317. The Shard of Alexander talisman, obtained from Alexander the Jar Warrior's questline, provides one of the largest damage boosts to skills in the game. Its description states that it contains the remains of Alexander, who fulfilled his ambition. The developers made the memorial of an NPC's completed life's goal into a power boost that is mechanically significant. Carrying his remains makes you stronger because he died at his best. Easter egg 318. The Warrior Jar Shard Talisman is a lesser version of the Shard of Alexander, found before completing his questline. Its description refers to a warrior whose ambition was not yet fulfilled. This creates a direct comparison between the two items that communicates Alexander's arc. The unfinished version makes you less powerful than the finished version. Growth comes with completion. Easter egg 319. The Prince of Death's staff, associated with Godwin's death phenomenon, scales with both faith and intelligence. This dual scaling is unusual for a staff, which normally scales with intelligence alone. The developers gave the staff associated with a figure who exists between life and death a mechanical identity that spans two different magical traditions, suggesting the power of Godwin's transformed state is not bound by the game's usual categories. Easter egg 320. The Spirit Caller's Shell Talisman, associated with the Spirit Caller snail bosses, reduces the cost of summoning spirit ashes. Its description attributes it to those who spent their lives calling and never being answered. This is a description of longing more than practice. The developers built yearning into the origin story of a talisman that facilitates connection with spirits. Those who call out into silence long enough develop the ability to call more efficiently. Easter egg 321. The Moon of Noxtella talisman, found in Noxtella the Eternal City, increases the number of memory slots for sorceries. Its description refers to Noxtella as a city that once looked up at the stars in reverence. The talisman connects the act of remembering more spells to the practice of remembering the stars. The developers built a cosmological metaphor for memory into a mechanical expansion of the player's spell capacity. Easter egg 322. The Arrow's Reach talisman, which increases the range of bows, is described as made from the sinew of a legendary archer who could hit targets at impossible distances. The implication is that the archer's physical material, the sinew, retained some of the quality that made them exceptional while alive. The developers built a theory of residual excellence into their crafting mythology. Easter egg 323. The Two-Headed Turtle talisman, which increases stamina recovery speed, depicts exactly what its name describes. The turtle imagery suggests something slow and steady. The developers used the turtle's most famous cultural association, with patience and persistence, as the visual metaphor for stamina recovery. Getting your stamina back faster is framed as being more like a turtle, which is counterintuitive and therefore memorable. Easter egg 324. The Crucible Feather Talisman and the Crucible Scale Talisman represent two different physical traits associated with the Crucible's primordial life forms. Having wings implies the capacity for flight and freedom. Having scales implies armor and resilience. The developers gave the two Crucible talismans different values that reflect what the physical trait they depict meant culturally, even though both come from the same tradition. Easter egg 325. There is a hidden room in the Academy of Raya Lucaria, accessible only through an illusory wall. Behind the wall is a chest. The chest contains a spell. The illusory wall is indicated only by a slight texture difference and the presence of a message left by another player. The developers built a discovery that is almost impossible to find without either luck or community knowledge, and placed a meaningful reward behind it to make the discovery worth the years some players wait before finding it. Easter egg 326. The illusory wall mechanic itself, inherited from previous From Software games, is treated by the community as a game-wide treasure hunt. Every wall in every dungeon is a potential secret. The developers built a paranoid exploratory behavior into their game's culture by using the mechanic consistently enough that players learn to test surfaces rather than simply accept them as boundaries. Easter egg 327. The weapon called Antspur Rapier deals Scarlet Rot build-up. Its description states it is modelled on the stinger of a large ant found in Caelid. The developers built the game's ecology into their weapon design. Ants in Caelid carry Scarlet Rot. A rapier modelled on an ant stinger also carries Scarlet Rot. The weapon's properties come from its biological inspiration. Easter egg 328. The Rotten Crystal Weapons, a category of weapons found in areas with crystal formations affected by Scarlet Rot, all deal both magic and rot damage. The combination of glintstone magic and Scarlet Rot in a single weapon type suggests that the crystals in certain regions have been affected by the rot in ways that altered their magical properties. The developers built environmental contamination into their weapon category's mechanical identity. Easter egg 329. The Frozen Needle weapon, which deals frost damage and can trigger a special effect against opponents suffering frost, was found in an area associated with a specific character's past. The needle and the frost connect to two different characters in the game, both named for piercing cold. The developers built a thematic intersection into a weapon's physical design that rewards players who know the lore of both connected characters. Easter egg 330. There is a minor NPC found near the entrance to Stormvale Castle who tells you about the Limgrave area in practical terms. He gives useful early game advice. If you return to him after defeating Godric, he is gone. He left. His only response to you being successful was to take his own cue and move on. The developers built a minor character who responds to the player's progress by finding his own exit, which is a form of characterization through absence. Easter egg 331. The Dialos questline involves tracking a missing servant named Lanya across multiple regions. Lanya is dead by the time you find where she was. The questline does not explain how she died or who was responsible in direct terms. The evidence you piece together suggests multiple possibilities. The developers built ambiguity into the conclusion of a questline about loss, refusing to provide a neat resolution to something that is not supposed to be neat. Easter egg 332. Dialos himself does not react to Lanya's death in the expected way. He does not pursue vengeance immediately. He goes quiet. He drifts. He eventually ends up in the Jar village, finding purpose again in a completely different context. The developers gave a character defined by grief a second chapter, rather than an ending, and the second chapter is tonally completely different from the first. Easter egg 333. The full moon associated with Renala and the dark moon associated with Rani are both present in the game, but the dark moon is described as appearing only when the full moon is absent. They occupy the same position in the sky at different times. The developers built a cosmological relationship between the two women into the game's celestial mechanics. Where one symbol is present, the other's is not. They are defined in part by what they are not. Easter egg 334. Millicent's sisters, the 5 flower maidens encountered in the Halig tree, are all described as daughters of Melania, but distinct from each other in their development and degree of rot. The developers built a family as a spectrum, where the same origin produces multiple different outcomes based on factors not fully explained. This is a family that has never been together and will never be, defined by shared biology and completely different paths. Easter egg 335. The Cleanrot Knight Finlay is mentioned in item descriptions as the knight who carried the unconscious Melania from the battlefield of the Ionia Swamp alone, through enemy territory to safety. The developers built an act of extraordinary loyalty into a background detail that the player never witnesses and that the game never depicts. Finlay's achievement is enormous, described in a few sentences of item description. Easter egg 336. The item called Golden Epitaph, a sword associated with the first generation after the Elden Ring's shattering, has a description that refers to it as a memorial for something that has not yet fully died. An epitaph is written after death. A golden epitaph for something not yet dead is a mourning that began too early, which the developers seem to have been using to describe the state of the Golden Order's traditions. Easter egg 337. The Helfen Steeple weapon, a tower-shaped weapon found in a ghostly spirit location, is described as modelled on a steeple seen in a vision by a soul that could not move on. The weapon is literally based on something someone dreamed from beyond death. The developers built the product of an afterlife vision into a physical weapon, suggesting that what exists in the material world is sometimes shaped by what persists in the spiritual. Easter egg 338. The gargoyle's weapons dropped by the Blackblade Kindred and other gargoyle boss types are described as weapons of divine protection turned to instruments of war. The gargoyles were designed to guard sacred sites. The fact that their weapons work well in combat suggests a sacred security function can escalate into something more aggressive, given the right circumstances. The developers built militarization into the history of a protective tradition. Easter egg 339. The Prince of Death's pustule and the Prince of Death's cyst are two separate talismans associated with the same phenomenon. One is smaller and provides a lesser benefit. One is larger and provides a greater benefit. The developers built a scale of Godwin's corruption into their talisman categories, where more advanced transformation means greater power. The further the corruption progresses, the more useful it becomes as a resource. This is one of the game's more uncomfortable mechanical implications. Easter egg 340. The Lord of Blood's Exaltation Talisman, which increases attack power when bleeding occurs nearby, does not specify that the bleeding must come from your enemies. Allies, summoned spirits, and the player character can all trigger its effect. The developers built an amoral weapon property into the talisman. It does not care about the source of the blood. This is consistent with Moog's philosophy of blood as a resource rather than a substance with moral significance. Easter egg 341. The Millicent's Prosthesis Talisman, which boosts dexterity and increases attack power with successive hits, is named for Millicent because the prosthetic arm associated with her questline is its material origin. Carrying the talisman means carrying a piece of Millicent's body. The developers built a memorial function into a mechanical stat boost, so that using the talisman is both a choice about build and a choice about remembrance. Easter egg 342. There is a cookfire near the first site of grace in Limgrave that has a small pot hanging above it. The pot contains nothing. There is no mechanical function to the pot or the fire. The developers placed a camp detail in the starting area that suggests recent habitation without any explanation for who was there or where they went. The first area of the game contains evidence of someone who was there and is now gone. Easter egg 343. The telescope placed on the hill near the starting site of Grace, which lets you zoom in on Stormvale Castle in the distance, is positioned precisely so that zooming in shows the castle from an angle that reveals its size and the difficulty of reaching it. The developers used a tutorial tool, the telescope, to do visual pacing, giving players their first real look at the early game destination through a lens that makes it feel far away. Easter egg 344. The tutorial message system in the opening area includes a message that specifically tells players that this game does not hold your hand. This message was written by the developers to set expectations. It is one of the most direct communication choices in a game that usually communicates obliquely. The developers decided to be clear about the contract the game is offering before the player has gone anywhere significant. Easter egg 345. The spirit spring near the Erdtree's outer boundary that launches Torrent high enough to see over the capital wall is positioned in such a way that the apex of the jump aligns exactly with a specific point in the distant Erdtree's crown. The developers aligned a traversal mechanic with a distant landmark precisely enough that players who do the jump and look in the right direction at the right moment see the Erdtree in a way they cannot from the ground. The jump is also a framing device. Easter egg 346. The game's world is divided into regions with different weather patterns. Limgrave has fair weather. The Weeping Peninsula has rain. Caelid has an eternal storm of scarlet particles. The mountaintops have blizzards. The developers built meteorological identity into each region so that stepping across a regional boundary is marked by a change in weather that communicates the new region's character before any other visual detail does. Easter egg 347. The time of day in the lands between cycles without being tied to the player's progress or the real-world clock. Enemies that only appear at night appear on this internal cycle. Players who explore during the day will find different enemies than those who wait until nightfall. The developers built a diurnal ecosystem where the world's population changes based on time, which makes the game's world feel like it has a functioning ecology. Easter egg 348. The Knight's Cavalry boss mentioned earlier can be found in different locations across the lands between on different nights. But if you find and follow the patrol route of a Knight's Cavalry over multiple game nights, you can track a pattern. The developers gave a nocturnal boss a route rather than a fixed location. The boss is always moving, always following a path, which means it was always going somewhere, rather than just patrolling in place. Easter egg 349. The Erdtree glows at night. During the day, it is bright and golden in the distance. At night, it becomes the only light source in the far distance, visible from almost everywhere in the lands between. This visual choice means the game's central sacred object is most visible in the dark. The developers made the Erdtree a beacon against night, which is consistent with how the Golden Order frames it, but also a practical visual design choice that uses the Erdtree to orient the player across the entire game world. Easter egg 350. The item called Radagon's Golden Order seal, the most powerful sacred seal in the game, is described as a personal seal used by Radagon in his role as the champion of the Golden Order. The fact that it can be found in the game at all implies either that Radagon lost it or that it was taken from him. The developers did not explain this. A personal seal belonging to a divine figure is just present in the world to be found, which is either a miraculous discovery, or a theft from someone who became too divine to need physical tools. Easter egg 351. The Saint Trina's torch, which emits a mist that causes sleep, is described as something found in the realm of dreams that Trina is said to rule. It suggests that Trina's domain is literal rather than symbolic. There is a realm of dreams. The torch came from it. The developers built a physical geography of sleep into the game's cosmology through the implication of an item's origin. Easter egg 352. The faded sacred tree sword, associated with the Eared tree but in a decayed form, suggests that there is a version of the Eared tree's divine weapon tradition that has become hollow and diminished. The contrast between the sacred relic sword, the fully divine version, and the faded sacred tree sword, the depleted version, suggests that the Eared tree's power is not infinite. Weapons that once carried its full authority can lose that connection. The developers built depletion into a divine weapon tradition. Easter egg 353. The claymore enemies found in Siofra River are described as homunculi, artificial beings created from clay. This connects them to the golem creation tradition and to a long history of artificially created beings in mythology, from the Jewish golem to figures in alchemical tradition. The developers built a tradition of artificial life into the game's underground civilizations and named the beings using a term from real-world traditions of magical creation. Easter egg 354. There are specific locations in the lands between where you can find two items placed very close together that, when their descriptions are read side by side, tell a story through contrast. The Frenzy Flame Stone and the Michaela's Needle placed near each other in certain areas suggest a design intention where the proximity communicates a relationship. The developers seem to have sometimes used spatial proximity as a form of lore delivery. Easter egg 355. The Halig tree's location on the game's map is in the far northeast, accessible only through a hidden passage. Its position, at the edge of the world, is consistent with its description as a place Michaela built away from the centers of power. The developers put their most hidden region at the farthest edge of their map, which is both practical and thematic. The most secret place is literally at the margin. Easter egg 356. The nomadic merchant found in the northern area of Limgrave, near the Warmaster's shack, sells incantations associated with the giant's tradition. He carries knowledge about a tradition that most of the population of the lands between would not have easy access to. The developers built knowledge access into their merchant placement, suggesting that some merchants carry specialized information because of where they have been and what they have encountered. Easter egg 357. The Warmaster's shack itself contains an NPC named Knight Bernal, who teaches Ashes of War. The shack is described as belonging to a master of war arts. Finding it early gives players access to combat techniques that dramatically affect how the early game plays. The developers built a significant tutorial resource into a location that requires no questline to find, rewarding players who explore rather than rushing toward the obvious objectives. Easter egg 358. The Church of Vows, which can reset NPC aggression if you accidentally attack a friendly character, contains a large turtle-like being named Miriel, Pastor of Vows. Miriel is one of the friendliest and most conversational NPCs in the game. He can be given scrolls and prayer books to teach you new spells and incantations. He talks about his faith with genuine warmth. The developers placed their most openly gentle NPC inside a building specifically dedicated to forgiveness, which is thematically precise. Easter egg 359. Miriel's item description reveals that he has been tending the Church of Vows for so long that he has forgotten how long it has been. The duration of his service is implied to be so great that memory itself could not hold it. The developers built a scale of devotion into an NPC who presents himself as modest and humble, so that what looks like a gentle old priest is actually a figure of almost incomprehensible constancy. Easter egg 360. The celestial dew required to use the Church of Vows absolution mechanic is described as tears shed by something that watched from above and mourned human conflict. This frames the forgiveness mechanic as coming from a compassionate cosmic observer who grieves the violence people do to each other. The developers built a theology of compassionate observation into the item that resets relationships, making the act of using it feel like receiving absolution from something that understood why it happened. Easter egg 361. The Tibia Mariner bosses, which are skeletal figures on boats who play instruments and summon undead, are described in lore as the pilots of boats that carry the dead to where they need to go. They are not evil, they are ferry captains for the deceased. The fact that they attack the living suggests they have been confused by the broken order of death in the current age, rather than that they are naturally hostile. The developers built a tragedy of dysfunction into their undead boat enemies. Easter egg 362. The weapon obtained from Tibia Mariner bosses, the skeletal militiaman's ashes, notes that the skeletal militiamen, under the mariner's command, were once soldiers who died in battle and were recruited into service. The undead enemies around the Tibia Mariner have histories. They were people who fought and died and are now working for a cosmic ferry captain in a role they never chose. The developers built involuntary afterlife employment into the lore of an enemy encounter. Easter egg 363. The Erd Tree Burial. Watchdog enemies found in catacombs are described as stone statues animated to guard the rites of burial. They do not have individual personalities or names. They are described as tools. The developers seem to have been thinking about the difference between beings created to serve a function and beings who developed a nature. The burial watchdogs are on the extreme end of the created to serve spectrum, and their blank ferocity in combat reflects that. Easter egg 364. There are bell-bearing drops from merchant NPCs who die during the course of the game's events. Some merchants who seem permanent can be found dead if certain questline conditions are met. Their bell bearings, containing their entire catalogue, can be given to the Twin Maiden Husks to restore access to their inventory. The developers built merchant mortality into their economy and provided a mechanic for continuing to access what a dead merchant knew. Easter egg 365. The Finger Maiden veil, worn by finger maidens throughout the game, is described as something worn by those who have dedicated their eyes to a specific purpose. The veil suggests concealment of something, and the description implies that the maiden's eyes are used in a different way than ordinary sight. The developers built a sensory specialization into the appearance of a religious role without fully explaining what that specialization entails. Easter egg 366. The glintstone crown helmets associated with different sorcery traditions at Raya Lucaria provide different stat boosts and penalties depending on which school they represent, but they all have glintstone embedded in the forehead. This location is associated in some real-world traditions with a third eye or a sight of enhanced perception. The developers place the sorcerer's source of magical vision at the point on the body associated with mystical insight, which is either a coincidence or an intentional reference. Easter egg 367. The Academy Glintstone staff, the most common staff found at Raya Lucaria, has a description noting it is the standard issue equipment for students. This establishes that Raya Lucaria has an enrollment and a standardized equipment protocol. The Academy is an institution with procurement practices and presumably a budget. The developers built bureaucratic texture into a magical institution. Easter egg 368. The glintstone scale talisman, which boosts the power of sorceries at the cost of survivability, is described as made from scales shed by a glintstone dragon. This implies there are or were dragons with glintstone properties, which connects two of the game's most significant magical traditions. The developers built a bridge between dragon mythology and sorcery mythology through a material produced by a creature that embodied both. Easter egg 369. The Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, the highest tier of the defensive dragon talisman, depicts a dragon in full extension rather than the coiled posture of the lower versions. Where the coiled dragon suggests protection through self-containment, the extended dragon suggests a more active posture of defense. The developers built a visual progression through a talisman tier that uses the dragon's posture to communicate the nature of the defense being offered. Easter egg 370. There are 3 versions of certain talismans, each higher tier providing more benefit with more cost. The Radagon's Saw Seal and Marika's Saw Seal follow this pattern with fixed costs. Other talismans follow a tier structure without costs. The developers seem to have deliberately chosen which mechanical benefits are worth complicating with costs and which should be straightforward upgrades. The cost-bearing talismans are associated with specific individuals rather than generic traditions. Easter egg 371. The commoner's headband, a simple cloth band with no protective value, is described as worn by those who are common by choice, rather than by birth, meaning those who have set aside the markers of rank they might otherwise display. This frames the most modest piece of headgear in the game as a philosophical statement rather than a default. Choosing to wear it is a form of self-identification with ordinariness. Easter egg 372. There is a cave in Liurnia called the Cave of the Forlorn that can only be entered during a hailstorm. The hailstorm is a weather event that occurs periodically. Players who attempt to enter the cave during fair weather find the entrance blocked. The developers built a weather-conditional access mechanic into a dungeon, which requires players to either wait for the right conditions or return during a different weather cycle. Easter egg 373. The enemy inside the Cave of the Forlorn is a misbegotten crusader, a creature associated with an enslaved people fighting under a divine banner. The description of the cave and its inhabitant suggests that this particular misbegotten chose solitude and faith over the company of others. The developers built a hermit narrative into a dungeon enemy, which makes defeating it feel different from defeating a more straightforwardly hostile opponent. Easter egg 374. The misbegotten enemies throughout the game are described as creatures treated as slaves and labourers who have risen against their oppressors in multiple locations. Their design, which gives them animalistic features and worn clothing, suggests a people who have been denied access to material resources while being required to do physical work. The developers built a class politics narrative into their enemy design that is most legible when you read the item descriptions rather than just fighting the enemies. Easter egg 375. The Crucible Knight Siluria, a late-game optional boss, has a weapon that suggests she was among the most ancient practitioners of the Crucible tradition. Her appearance includes more pronounced animalistic features than other Crucible Knights. The developers built a timeline into their enemy variant, where more pronounced features indicate greater antiquity. Siluria is older in tradition, and her body shows it. Easter egg 376. The item called the Lord's Rune, the highest value rune item in the game, is described as something used only by lords and rulers to mark ownership or authority. Using it to level up is an act of consuming the authority of rulers to fuel personal growth. The developers made the consumption of the power of governance into the most efficient form of experience gain, which is either a political joke or a piece of narrative consistency about what advancement in this world costs. Easter egg 377. There are a handful of locations in the lands between where you can find notes written by characters who are identified only by what they have observed rather than by who they are. A note from a soldier, a note from a student, a note from a traveller. These notes tell you about the world from perspectives that the game usually does not foreground. The developers built a commons of anonymous observation into their environmental storytelling. Easter egg 378. The finger reader NPCs, the blind women who read the messages left by the two fingers, speak in a cadence that is different from all other NPCs. Their speech is slower and more pausing. The developers seem to have directed their voice performances to suggest a form of attention that operates differently from ordinary perception, as if reading something others cannot see requires a different way of speaking. Easter egg 379. The Haligtree's visual design has one major colour distinction from the rest of the game. Where the Erdtree and its affiliated areas use gold, the Haligtree uses a warmer amber and pink. The developers chose to make Miquella's alternative tree visually distinct from the Erdtree, not by making it cold or dark, but by making it warmer and more human in its colour palette. The rebellion against the Golden Order's aesthetic is a rebellion towards something softer. Easter egg 380. The presence of the omens in the sewers beneath Lanedale suggests that the capital's hidden infrastructure doubles as a containment system for those deemed cursed and untouchable. The sewers are labyrinthine and have clearly been inhabited for some time. The developers built a literal underclass geography into their capital city, so that the distance between the golden halls above and the rot-filled tunnels below is also a social distance that has physical form. Easter egg 381. There is a character named Morgott, who is the secret identity of Margit. Morgott is an omen, a cursed member of the royal lineage, who has been hiding his nature beneath Margit's disguise. When you encounter him as Morgott in Leyndell, his dialogue suggests he has been guarding the capital not because he loves its rulers, but because he loves the idea of what the capital represents, despite everything it has done to people like him. The developers built a tragedy of loyalty to ideals rather than institutions into their early game fake-out boss. Easter egg 382. Morgott's Great Rune, when you defeat him and claim it, has a description that refers to it as a rune without power, because Morgott, as a cursed omen, was denied access to the full measure of his grace. The developers built a mechanical reflection of social exclusion into a boss drop. The rune is diminished because its owner was diminished. The object carries the history of how its owner was treated. Easter egg 383. The Fell Omen cloak is an armour piece associated with Margit's disguise. Its description notes that it was made to conceal an omen's horns and tail. The developers built the functional need of concealment into the design of a specific garment, so that wearing the cloak means wearing the tool of someone's shame at their own nature. The garment has a purpose that is about hiding rather than displaying. Easter egg 384. The golden lineage of Marika and Radagon has produced, by the game's law, a remarkable range of offspring, with wildly different abilities and orientations. Radan has gravity magic, Rani has witch sorcery, Miquella has healing and enchanting, Melania has the scarlet rot. The developers built genetic diversity into a divine family in a way that makes each child feel like they carry a different aspect of their parentage, rather than all having the same inherited power. Easter egg 385. The grace and the guidance mechanics, where golden guidance flows from sites of grace toward important locations, and Torrent's ability to sense nearby grace, are both described as natural phenomena that arise in the presence of the Erdtree's influence. The developers built navigation aids into the game's theology, so that finding your way is described as a form of divine attention, rather than a game design convenience. Easter egg 386. The item called Stone Sword Key was referenced in a pre-release trailer in a way that made players think it was more significant than it turned out to be. The developers included the item in marketing footage, which led to extensive speculation before launch. When the game released, the key was important, but not as cosmologically significant as fans had theorized. The developers seem to have accepted that they created this ambiguity and allowed it to become part of the game's pre-release mythology. Easter egg 387. There is a giant pot enemy type, distinct from the jar warriors, called a living jar. Living jars are hostile. Their description suggests they were created for a specific purpose that has since been forgotten by the beings inside them. They do not know why they do what they do. The developers built existential confusion into their aggressive jar enemies, which contrasts with Alexander and his kind, who are defined precisely by purpose and ambition. Easter egg 388. The Flame of the Fell. God incantation, mentioned earlier, can be obtained only after a specific sequence of events in the game's open world. The boss that drops it is found in a lake. The lake itself is accessible through a path that most players take by accident, rather than by design. The developers embedded one of the game's more powerful incantations behind a traversal experience that many players attribute to chance rather than design. Easter egg 389. The Glint Sword Talisman increases the duration of magical swords conjured by spells. Its description refers to it as made for those whose patience in combat outlasts their opponents. This is a description of a specific combat philosophy, winning by maintaining magical constructs for longer rather than by striking harder or faster. The developers built tactical patience into the mechanical function of a talisman. Easter egg 390. The meteorite staff, found early in the game in a specific location with a body that has an item description pointing toward it, is described as made from a meteorite that carries glintstone properties. This is the best staff for certain sorcery builds in the early and mid-game. Its placement in the game world, accessible very early, but requiring exploration to find, reflects a design philosophy where mechanical power is available to those who search rather than those who simply progress. Easter egg 391. The Jellyfish Shield, a shield associated with the spectral jellyfish of the game, increases resistance to certain status effects in a way that mimics the bioluminescent jellyfish's natural properties. The developers built ecological accuracy into their shield design. A shield made from jellyfish material resists the things jellyfish naturally resist. The game's material logic is consistent with its biological logic. Easter egg 392. The Fingerprint Stone Shield, one of the heaviest shields in the game, bears the fingerprint pattern associated with the two fingers and the greater will. The description notes that carrying it feels like something watching through it. The developers built a surveillance anxiety into a defensive item, suggesting that using the shield associated with the ruling cosmic order means being observed by it. Easter egg 393. The Lusar's glintstone staff requires very high intelligence to use effectively, but provides the most powerful sorcery boost in the game. This gate, where the game's most powerful tool requires the most investment, is consistent across multiple weapon and staff categories. The developers built a consistent philosophy of investment and return into their equipment scaling, so that the highest power always costs the most commitment. Easter egg 394. The Astrologer's Cookbook, which teaches crafting of items related to stargazing and magical research, is found in locations associated with astronomical observation throughout the lands between. The developers connected the distribution of a knowledge item to the geography of the practice it represents. People who studied the stars in this world went to high places and looked up, and that is where their knowledge was left behind. Easter egg 395. The map fragment system, where you find pieces of the lands between map on bodies near stone columns throughout the world, is designed so that the game world is visible in approximate form from the beginning, but becomes more detailed as you find each fragment. The developers built a knowledge of territory progression into the map itself, so that the map grows more detailed as you do, mirroring the relationship between a traveller and the land they explore. Easter egg 396. The grace that guides you to legacy dungeons when you first arrive at a grace near them is described as instinctual rather than directed. The guides move on their own. The developers built an automatic orientation toward important locations into the game's divine favour system, suggesting that the Erdtree's power naturally draws the attention of those it favours toward the sources of power it once reclaimed, which makes the whole game feel less like exploration and more like a calling. Easter egg 397. The sacrificial twig talisman, which breaks to prevent a rune loss on death, is described as made from a branch that a child broke from a sacred tree as a keepsake. The mundane origin of something that prevents the loss of all your accumulated experience reframes what runes are. They are accumulated progress. Losing them is a kind of forgetting. A broken twig from a child's hand is what holds that memory. Easter egg 398. The crimson tear. Husks used in crafting are described as the dried husks of crystal tears that have had their restorative power exhausted. This implies that crystal tears are used up rather than eternal, and that what remains after the power is gone still has some utility. The developers built a life cycle into their magical crafting material, where the empty shell of something powerful still has a secondary purpose. Easter egg 399. The item called Dragon Wound Grease mentioned earlier is found in areas where dragons are or were present. The developers placed this material near its source in the ecology. Dragon Wound Grease comes from wounded dragons, and it is found where dragons are. The game's material ecology is consistent with itself. Easter egg 400. The presence of the Elden Ring as an object, never seen but always central, is itself the most significant design decision in the game. Everything the player does is in relation to something that is never directly shown. The developers built an entire open-world game around an absent object. The game's title refers to something the player character never holds, never touches, and never fully understands. The ring is always there, implied by everything, present in nothing. Easter egg 401. The finger reader Enya, when you first speak to her, refers to you as the newest of the tarnished seeking the Elden Ring. The word newest implies there were others before you, and implies they are gone. By the time you arrive at the Round Table Hold, the line of tarnished who have tried this before you is already long and ended. The developers built a history of failure into the greeting extended to the player character. Easter egg 402. The final message at the end of the game, regardless of ending, uses a specific phrase about the lands between that has multiple possible meanings depending on which ending you chose. The developers wrote an ending message that is intentionally ambiguous about whether what happened was good, completing the game's commitment to presenting the player's choices without judgment. Easter egg 403. The Flock's Canvas Talisman, which boosts incantation power, is described as made from the canvas used by a shepherd who painted their flock to remember each of them. This is one of the most unexpectedly tender item descriptions in the game. A shepherd who painted portraits of sheep. The artwork became a power amplifier. The developers built the act of paying careful attention to small things, of noticing and recording what others might overlook, into a power enhancement. Easter egg 404. The weapon skill system, Ashes of War, is described in its general framing as the recovered techniques of the warriors of the past. Using a weapon skill means performing an action developed by someone who is no longer alive. Combat in Elden Ring is presented as an act of inheritance. Every technique you use was someone else's technique first. The developers built a tradition of learned movement into their combat system's lore framing. Easter egg 405. There is a specific area in Stormvale Castle where the layout of the rooms matches the layout described in an item description found elsewhere in the game, almost exactly. Players who read the item description first and then found the room, reported recognizing it. The developers built cross-referential environmental storytelling between item descriptions and physical spaces, rewarding players who read carefully and then looked carefully. Easter egg 406. The Sealed Tunnel, a dungeon in Altus Plateau, contains a section where the dungeon's walls are made of a different stone than the rest. The stone matches the stone used in Leyendell's construction, rather than the Altus Plateau's natural geology. This suggests the tunnel was built by the capital's construction tradition, rather than by whatever built the rest of the dungeon. The developers built architectural archaeology into a dungeon's wall texture. Easter egg 407. The presence of rot in areas far from Caelid, in small patches, and isolated infections throughout the lands between, suggests that the scarlet rot is spreading rather than contained. The developers built an active contamination narrative into the game's ecology that plays out not in cutscenes, but in the presence of unexpected rot patches in areas that should be clean. The disease is moving slowly, and the world's geography is where you see that. Easter egg 408. The smithing master Hugh, when you tell him you intend to do something dangerous, responds with something that sounds like concern, but is framed as professional interest in whether you will return his work undamaged. This is the emotional language of someone who cares about someone else, but expresses it as practical concern rather than sentiment. The developers wrote care as displacement, which is one of the more emotionally recognizable character choices in the game. Easter egg 409. The weapons that can be imbued with Ash of War. Abilities have a specific set of affinity options that change the weapon's damage type and scaling. The blood affinity, which adds bleed buildup, is described as the practice of channeling vitality through the weapon rather than through the body. This is a lore description of blood magic that treats the weapon as a conduit for biological force rather than just a sharpened object. The developers built a theory of blood as vital energy into a weapon upgrade mechanic. Easter egg 410. The sacred affinity, which adds holy damage and faith scaling, is described as imbuing a weapon with the blessing of the Erd Tree's light. This is the only affinity described as a blessing rather than as a technique or a property. The developers distinguished holy damage from other damage types by giving it a divine origin rather than a material one. Doing holy damage is receiving grace and passing it through the weapon. The other damage types come from the weapon itself. Holy comes from above. Easter egg 411. The cold affinity, which adds frost damage and intelligence scaling, is described as channeling the coldness of ancient stone. This is a geological rather than climatic description. Cold is not the cold of weather, but the cold of something very old and very dense. The developers built a different conceptual source for their frost damage type than the obvious one, giving intelligence scaling frost weapons a connection to antiquity rather than to weather. Easter egg 412. The arcane affinity, which adds discovery and certain status build-up to weapons, is described as attuning the weapon to the hidden properties of the world. The word hidden here aligns with Arcane's general identity as the skill associated with finding things that are not obvious. The developers built a philosophy of concealed knowledge into the scaling attribute associated with discovery, so that building toward Arcane is building toward the ability to find what others miss. Easter egg 413. The strength attribute, when at very high levels, allows the player to two-hand weapons with nearly double the effective strength value. This is described in the game's help text as channeling your physical strength into the grip of the weapon so completely that the act of holding it concentrates your force. The developers built a physical theory of strength amplification into a two-handing mechanic that most games treat as a simple damage modifier. Easter egg 414. The endurance attribute, which controls stamina and equip load, is described as the measure of one's capacity to act and to carry. This double meaning, both acting and carrying, frames endurance not just as physical capacity, but as the willingness to bear weight. The developers built a dual definition into their physical capacity stat that makes it sound like a virtue as much as an attribute. Easter egg 415. The mind attribute, which controls FP, is described as the seat of thought and spirit. This is a deliberate philosophical choice. In many traditions, the mind is associated with reason and the spirit is associated with something else. The developers collapsed the distinction, making the attribute that powers both sorcery and incantation a single thing that covers both thought and spirit. Magic in the game is neither purely rational nor purely devotional. It draws from something that includes both. Easter egg 416. The character you create at the start of the game, the Tarnished, has no defined history. The starting classes give hints at what they may have been before becoming tarnished, but those histories are suggestions, not facts. The developers gave the player an origin that is deliberately unresolved. You arrive in the lands between not knowing who you were before. The world you enter is also trying to recover from a shattered history. The developers match the condition of the player character to the condition of the world. Both are defined by what was lost and what might be recovered. Everything you do in the lands between is an act of becoming someone in a world that is trying to become something, and neither process is finished when the credits roll.